Somewhere beneath the red dust of Northern California, beneath the crumbling memory of a civilization that believed itself permanent, a story began that the wasteland would carry for generations. The world of Fallout 2 is not simply a setting, it is a living record of choices made and unmade, of peoples who survived by holding tightly to whatever scraps of meaning the bombs had left behind. It is a world that rewards the quiet observer, the patient wanderer who paces long enough to read the names on the graves, to notice the way a settlement's walls lean slightly inward against the desert wind, to understand that every ruin was once somebody's hope. Before you drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos like this, and share where you're watching from tonight. Let that quietness settle over you now as we begin tracing the full, unhurried lore of Fallout 2, one gentle thread at a time, beginning in a canyon village so small that most of the wasteland had never heard its name. Arroyo was a tribal settlement carved into the canyon country of what had once been southern Oregon. It was not a grand place by any measure. Its dwellings were modest, built from salvaged timber and sun-dried clay, and its people lived close to the earth in ways that most of the post-war world had forgotten. They farmed, they gathered, they kept the old customs alive through ceremony and memory, and the careful repetition of stories told around evening fires. In many ways, Arroyo looked like it had always been there, like something ancient, rather than something born from catastrophe. But Arroyo's origins were not ancient at all. The village had been founded by a single wanderer from the old world, a person who had walked out of Vault 13 80 years before the events of the game and had kept walking north until the desert gave way to something quieter. That wanderer had become a legend to the people of Arroyo, a figure elevated so completely into myth that the younger generations spoke of their ancestor with the same reverence they gave to the land itself. They called this ancestor the Vault Dweller, and they understood in broad strokes that this person had done something great once, something that had required tremendous courage. The Vault Dweller had left behind a journal. It was a careful document, written in a voice that was honest and sometimes weary, describing the events of the first Fallout story in the language of someone who had actually lived through them. This journal had passed down through the decades until it reached the hands of the Elder, the spiritual and practical leader of Arroyo when the game begins. The Elder had read those words many times. She understood better than anyone what the old world had been, what it had done to itself, and what it had cost ordinary people to survive its ending. Arroyo was organized around the principle of communal resilience. There was no great wealth there, no surplus of technology, no stockpile of pre-war luxury. The tribe had enough to sustain itself through careful management of its crops, its water, and its relationships with the surrounding land. The tribal customs were elaborate in places, drawing from a blend of pre-war memory and post-war necessity. Coming-of-age rituals had developed over the generations, rites that tested a young person's resourcefulness, courage, and endurance. These trials were taken seriously, not as arbitrary tradition, but as genuine preparation for a world that was still genuinely dangerous. The protagonist of Fallout 2 grew up inside this world. Born to the tribe as a descendant of the Vault Dweller, the player character carried a particular weight of expectation from birth. Within Arroyo's small social world, that lineage mattered. It shaped how the community saw this person, what roles they were expected to fill, and what burdens they were expected to carry when the time came. The Chosen One, as the protagonist would come to be called, was not simply a hero by circumstance. They were a hero by designation long before they ever left the canyon. The crisis that set Fallout 2 into motion was not dramatic in the way that early disasters often are in stories. It began slowly, the way real suffering tends to begin, through the gradual failure of ordinary systems. Arroyo's crops had been declining for several seasons. The soil was becoming less reliable, yields were dropping, and the people who depended on those harvests were beginning to feel the slow pressure of scarcity. There was enough food to survive on, but not enough to thrive, and the community could see the direction things were moving. The elder gathered knowledge from the oldest corners of what the tribe remembered. Somewhere in those memories, preserved in the vault dweller's journal and in the handed down words of survivors, was a reference to a device called the Garden of Eden Creation Kit. The GEAC, as it was known in shorthand, was a piece of vault tech technology originally designed to help vault populations rebuild agricultural civilization after the nuclear war. It contained soil supplements, water purification systems, seed varieties cultivated for durability, and a cold fusion generator that could power the whole assembly. In theory, a single GEC deployed in the right conditions could transform a patch of wasteland into something genuinely fertile. Vault 13, the vault dweller had once escaped from and later helped save, had possessed a GECK. The elder believed that one might still be there, preserved inside those sealed walls, waiting for someone to come and claim it. The decision to send the chosen one out into the world to find this device was not made lightly. It meant sending the tribe's most capable young person into a wasteland that had changed enormously in the decades since their ancestor had walked it. Cities had risen where there had been nothing. Factions had consolidated power. Roads had formed along old trade routes, and strangers passed through territories that had once been empty. The Chosen One's journey began with a trial, as all important journeys in Arroyo did. The Temple of Trials was a site of testing, a gauntlet of challenges that any worthy representative of the tribe was expected to complete before undertaking a mission of this significance. It was not designed to be easy. It demanded problem solving, physical capability, and the kind of measured calm that could navigate danger without losing oneself to panic. The Chosen One passed through it and emerged on the other side as someone officially sanctioned by the community to carry Arroyo's hope outward into the world. Beyond the canyon walls, California opened wide. The world was larger than the village, noisier, more complicated, and populated with people whose goals did not align naturally with anyone else's. The Chosen One would need to learn that quickly. The town of Klamath was one of the first significant settlements the Chosen One encountered on the road south. It was a small community built around the trapping and trade of the large mutated creatures called Brahmin, two-headed cattle descended from the livestock that had survived the war. Brahmin were enormously valuable in the post-war world. They provided meat, leather, and labor, and a community that could reliably work with Brahmin had something that many other settlements wanted. Klamath had built its modest economy on this foundation. The people of Klamath were rough, but not unkind. They were the sort of community that had learned to manage with very little and to find satisfaction in the management itself. The trapping families passed their knowledge down from parent to child, understanding that the land outside the settlement was unpredictable and that skill mattered more than luck in the long run. There were tensions within the community, the kind of social friction that any small isolated group develops over time, but there was also genuine camaraderie and a shared investment in keeping the settlement alive. The den sat further south, and it was a different kind of place entirely. Where Klamath was defined by honest labor, the den had organized itself around the exchange of less reputable commodities. It was a trading hub in the loosest possible sense, a gathering point for people who needed things that more respectable communities would not provide. Drugs moved through the den in considerable quantities. Stolen goods passed through its informal markets, and perhaps most significantly, the den had become a center for a slave trade that extended its reach through much of the surrounding region. The slaver operation in the den was run by a figure known as Metzger. He was not a complicated man in terms of his motivations. He understood power as the ability to compel others, and he had built his operation on that understanding. The people who passed through Metzger's hands were transported to locations that needed labor and were willing to pay for it, no questions asked. For the chosen one arriving in the den with purely practical goals, Metzger's presence was a moral variable that could not be entirely ignored, even if confronting it directly was not immediately necessary. The den also offered something more useful to the journey, which was information and commerce. A man named Vic had been enslaved there, and Vic happened to be a mechanic and trader who knew routes across the region and had connections that the chosen one needed. Finding and freeing Vic was one of the early threads of the journey, a task that wove practical necessity together with the more personal kind of motivation that good stories tend to require. Vault City occupied a fascinating position in the world of Fallout 2. It was, by most measurable standards, the most technologically advanced settlement in the region. The vault from which it had grown, Vault 8, had been one of the few vaults designed to open on schedule and to function more or less as advertised. Its residents had emerged with their equipment intact, their social structures relatively preserved, and a set of resources that allowed them to build something durable in the wasteland. The technology available to Vault City was genuinely impressive. Its medical capabilities exceeded anything else in the region by a significant margin. The city maintained working computers, functioning infrastructure, and a level of organized administration that was almost without parallel in Northern California. The citizens, as the Vault's descendants called themselves, enjoyed a quality of life that would have been recognizable to the pre-war world in ways that most wasteland communities could not claim. The cost of this success, however, was a social stratification that had calcified over decades into something uncomfortably rigid. Citizens occupied the top tier of Vault City's social order. Below them were outsiders, people who lived in the shantytown just beyond the city's walls and who could not claim the full rights and protections of citizenship. Citizenship was extraordinarily difficult to obtain and was guarded with the kind of institutional jealousy that tends to emerge when a small group has something genuinely valuable to protect. The leader of Vault City during this period was Counselor Lynette, a woman whose intelligence and administrative capability were matched by a coldness toward those she considered beneath the city's standards. She was not simply a villain in the conventional sense. Her protectiveness of Vault City came from a genuine belief that what the Vault had preserved was worth preserving, that the standards and discipline that had allowed the city to survive were not arbitrary but essential. Her contempt for outsiders was an extension of that logic, taken past the point where it remained defensible. The conflict between Vault City and the nearby ghoul settlement of Gecko illustrated the tensions that defined much of the region. Gecko's population consisted of ghouls, humans who had been transformed by radiation exposure into beings with extended lifespans but profoundly altered appearances. They had built their community around an old nuclear power plant that they were attempting to maintain and operate. Their goal was simply to keep the lights on, to generate power that might benefit the whole region. Vault City, however, viewed Gecko's proximity and the occasional radiation leaks from the imperfectly maintained plant as an unacceptable threat. The two communities were locked in a dispute that combined practical concerns with the kind of deep-seated prejudice that had outlasted the civilization that first cultivated it. Broken Hills was a mining community that had developed around rich deposits of uranium ore. What made Broken Hills remarkable in the context of the wasteland was its population, which included humans, ghouls, and super mutants living and working alongside one another in a fragile but genuine collaboration. The town had not achieved this harmony through any grand ideological breakthrough. It had arrived at it through the practical recognition that the mine was dangerous enough to kill anyone regardless of what they looked like, and that the work went better when people cooperated. The super mutants of Broken Hills were remnants of the Unity's failed experiment, the massive army of mutated soldiers that the Master had assembled in the events of the first game. After the Master's defeat, many super mutants had scattered across the wasteland. Some had become violent and territorial. Others had found their way to communities where they could contribute something. The ones who settled in Broken Hills had made a choice that required a certain kind of steadiness, to build rather than destroy, to work alongside people who might fear or resent them. Marcus was one of the most significant super mutant characters in Fallout 2. He was an elder of the super mutant community in Broken Hills, a figure of considerable age and experience who had seen enough of the wasteland to develop what could only be called philosophical patience. Marcus had fought in the Master's army. He had believed in his time in the idea that super mutants represented an evolutionary advancement, a harder, stronger successor to ordinary humanity. The defeat of the Master had not simply ended that belief. It had given him decades to examine it from multiple angles. The threats to Broken Hills were multiple and intersecting. A group of humans within the community had developed a plan to poison the town's mutant population, driven by a combination of fear and the belief that the settlement would be better off without them. This conspiracy ran quietly beneath the surface of Broken Hills' apparent cooperation, a reminder that the town's diversity had not fully resolved the tensions that came with it. There was also the mechanical concern of the mine itself, whose air filtration system required maintenance that tested the community's technical resources. Both problems demanded attention, and the Chosen One had the unusual ability to approach them without the tribal affiliations that blinded most of the town's residents. The city of New Reno occupied a unique ecological niche in the wasteland of Northern California. It was not simply a city. It was an acknowledgement that certain elements of human society had survived the nuclear war not by accident, but because they were too deeply embedded in human nature to be destroyed by mere catastrophe. New Reno was a city of vice, of gambling and illicit trade, and the kind of power structures that grow up wherever there is wealth moving through unregulated channels. 4 crime families could control New Reno with varying degrees of subtlety and ambition. The bishops were among the most politically sophisticated, maintaining connections to the wider regional power structures in ways that the other families did not bother with. The Wrights had built their position on the control of alcohol, a commodity that pre-war history had already demonstrated was almost impossible to keep people from wanting. The Mordinos had cornered the drug trade with the particular ruthlessness that came from having fought hardest for a market that everyone wanted, and the Salvatores had relationships with the Enclave, the mysterious and powerful faction that would eventually emerge as the game's principal antagonist. New Reno's relationship with the drug called Jet was central to understanding the city's economy and the broader regional dynamics of the game. Jet was a stimulant that had appeared in the wasteland relatively recently, powerful and profoundly addictive. Its origins were murkier than most users knew. The Mordinos believed they had developed it themselves, and in a narrow sense that was true. What most people did not know was that Jet's creation had been guided by forces connected to the Enclave, who had engineered it as a means of softening and destabilizing the populations of settlements they intended to eventually control. A drug that enslaved its users to compulsive consumption was, from a certain cold perspective, a strategic asset. The New Reno families navigated their relationships with one another through a combination of negotiation, bribery, and occasional violence. Alliances shifted, marriages were arranged to consolidate power, territory disputes were resolved through a process that was more like professional negotiation than open warfare, though the threat of violence was never entirely absent from the conversation. The Chosen One moving through New Reno could choose to align with any of these factions, a choice that had consequences not just for the immediate mission, but for the ending slides that resolved each location's story. Reading was a gold mining town that had found itself caught between the competing ambitions of the region's larger powers. The new California Republic wanted Reading's gold to back its currency and stabilize its growing economy. The Mordino family wanted Reading's population addicted to jet so that the city's workforce could be economically controlled and its political will softened. And the Wrights wanted access to Reading's trade routes to expand their alcohol distribution network. The citizens of Reading, meanwhile, mostly wanted to be left alone to mine their gold in peace. The gold rush quality of Reading's social atmosphere was something the game rendered with considerable accuracy. Mining towns have a particular sociology, one that combines intense physical labor with a transient population, a culture of immediate reward, and the social volatility that comes from people living close together under difficult conditions. The town had saloons and drug dens and the kind of informal justice system that emerges when formal institutions haven't caught up with population growth. The sheriff's office existed, but operated with limited authority over a community that preferred to handle its disputes personally. The Wanamingo mine was one of Redding's more significant environmental problems. A creature called the Wanamingo, a large and aggressive alien-descended organism that Vault-Tec's pre-war experiments had inadvertently introduced to the region, had taken up residence in the deeper sections of the mine. Their presence had shut down operations in that shaft and represented a threat that the mining community could not resolve with conventional methods. The Chosen One's ability to clear the mine was one of several ways to win goodwill and political currency in Reading, the kind of practical problem solving that kept the journey moving forward even when its moral dimensions became complicated. The Enclave was the hidden architecture beneath Fallout 2's surface story, the antagonist that the game revealed slowly and with deliberate patience. By the time its full shape became clear, the player had spent hours in a wasteland that seemed to have its own independent existence, and the Enclave's emergence reframed everything that had come before. The organization was not simply a band of villains, it was the remnant of the United States federal government, or rather, a version of that government that had survived the war in bunkers and offshore platforms and had spent the intervening decades developing plans for what to do when it was ready to return. The Enclave's platform was, on its surface, a recovery narrative. They were the legitimate government, they were the heirs to the pre-war order. They had preserved the best of old world technology and the theoretical framework of constitutional governance, and they intended to restore American civilization to the continent that the bombs had scorched. This was not, by itself, an entirely ridiculous position. A great many factions in the wasteland believed in some version of restoration, in the idea that the old world had been better than the current one, and that rebuilding toward it was a worthy project. What distinguished the Enclave from a genuinely benevolent recovery organization was the biological logic underneath their plans. The Enclave had concluded that the survivors of the nuclear war were not, properly speaking, fully human any longer. Radiation exposure over generations had altered the genetic profile of the wasteland's population in ways that the Enclave considered disqualifying. They were not willing to build a new civilization out of people they considered compromised. Their plan was to use a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus, the same technology that had created supermutants, to release an airborne pathogen that would kill every living being in the wasteland who had absorbed sufficient radiation to alter their genetics, which was functionally everyone. The FEV modification was the project that gave Fallout 2 its moral clarity. Everything else in the game operated in gray zones, with factions that had defensible motivations and individuals whose choices made sense within their contexts. The Enclave's plan removed ambiguity by being simply and completely a project of genocide. The difference between the Enclave and previous Fallout antagonists was not merely one of scale, though the scale was enormous. It was that the Enclave genuinely believed they were right. that their extermination of the irradiated population was not cruelty but policy, a difficult but necessary precondition for the society they intended to build. President Dick Richardson was the face of this ideology within the game. He occupied the Enclave's presidential residence with the institutional confidence of someone who had never seriously entertained the possibility that his position might be wrong. His speeches and his manner carried the rhythms of legitimate authority. He spoke of sacrifice and necessity and the long view of history. He used the language of governance to describe the planning of a mass killing. The contrast between his presentation and the reality of what he was proposing was one of the game's most pointed observations about how dangerous ideas rarely announce themselves as such. The oil rig was the Enclave's primary base of operations, a retrofitted offshore oil platform that had been converted into a self-contained governmental and military installation decades before the war began. It sat off the California coast, isolated from the wasteland by the Pacific Ocean, and its distance had been both its protection and its limitation. The Enclave there had access to some of the most advanced technology remaining anywhere in the world, power armor of a quality that surpassed what even the Brotherhood of Steel possessed, weaponry that was genuinely devastating, medical and scientific capabilities that could accomplish things the wasteland considered impossible. The internal culture of the oil rig was a kind of social compression chamber. The people who had grown up there were generations removed from the actual pre-war United States, but they maintained its institutional forms with an almost religious fidelity. Rank mattered. Chain of command was observed. The cultural trappings of Old World American governance were preserved in careful ritual, not because they served obvious functional purposes, but because they were the identity markers that distinguished the Enclave from the chaos outside its walls. To abandon those forms would have been to admit that the thing they were preserving might not be worth preserving. Frank Horrigan was the Enclave's most powerful physical asset and one of Fallout 2's most memorable antagonists. He had been a soldier before becoming what he was, an ordinary serviceman who had been subjected to the Enclave's supermutant research as part of an experimental program, and had survived the process in a form that was no longer entirely recognizable as human. He had been fitted with a suit of advanced power armor that had been permanently integrated with his body, a merger of machine and mutated flesh that gave him capabilities far beyond any conventional combatant. What made Horrigan interesting beyond his role as a final physical obstacle was the texture of his psychology. He had not lost his sense of self in the transformation. He still understood himself as a soldier, still operated within the framework of duty and order that the Enclave had given him. His loyalty to the Enclave was absolute, and it was not the loyalty of a broken mind, but of someone who had found the only identity available to him and had committed to it completely. The horror of Horrigan was not simply what he had become physically. It was that someone had made him this way and called it service. The new California Republic was the game's example of what successful post-war institution building looked like from the inside. It had grown from the chaos that Vault 15's diverse and quarrelsome population had generated when that vault opened, factions forming and dispersing, and eventually, through a long series of conflicts and negotiations, coalescing around a governing structure that borrowed its framework from pre-war democratic forms. By the time of Fallout 2, the NCR was a genuine political entity with a president, a Congress, an army, and an economy. President Tandy was one of the most important characters in the broader Fallout universe, connecting the events of the first game to the world of the second in a way that gave the series a sense of coherent history. She had been a young woman in the first Fallout, a resident of the town of Shady Sands who had been kidnapped by raiders and rescued by the Vault Dweller. Decades later, she had grown into the NCR's most consequential political leader, a figure whose tenure had shaped the Republic's values and its direction, in ways that would still be visible in Fallout New Vegas. Tandy's governing philosophy was pragmatic in the best sense of that word. She believed in building durable institutions rather than charismatic movements, in the slow accumulation of capacity and trust over the quick victories of force. She was not naive about the wasteland's dangers, but she believed that the only way to genuinely address those dangers was to build systems that could outlast any individual's lifespan. The NCR she governed was imperfect, riven with the corruption and inefficiency that any large organization develops, but it was trying to be something that most of the wasteland was not, which was a society that could keep growing. The NCR's relationship to Vault 15 was one of the game's more nuanced political threads. The Vault had been home to a diverse population that fractured after opening, with different groups eventually forming raider gangs, smaller settlements, and the proto-community that became the NCR. The Khans, one of the raider groups that had emerged from Vault 15's collapse, had continued their existence in the region and represented an ongoing challenge to the NCR's expansion northward. The vault itself had been occupied by another raider group called the Squat, and the information contained in its computers was important enough to the NCR's expansion plans that recovering it became a mission objective. The Brotherhood of Steel appeared in Fallout 2 in a form that reflected the organization's particular relationship with the post-war world. Unlike the new California Republic, which was building outward and looking for ways to bring more people under its umbrella, the Brotherhood had always been fundamentally inward-facing. Its mission was the preservation and study of technology, and its institutional culture was built around the idea that this mission was best served by controlling access to that technology rather than distributing it. The Fallout 2 era Brotherhood was somewhat more dispersed than the organization would appear in later games. Individual paladins and members were present throughout the region, but the organization's central installation remained in the Lost Hills Bunker, the pre-war military facility that had been the Brotherhood's original home. The Brotherhood in this period was navigating questions about its own purpose that it would continue to struggle with across the series, questions about whether hoarding knowledge served the wasteland better than sharing it, about whether the obligation to preserve technology was compatible with the obligation to use it for human benefit. The relationship between the Brotherhood and the Enclave was one of the game's more carefully handled background tensions. Both organizations preserved pre-war technology as a central mission. Both maintained higher technological standards than the surrounding wasteland, but their underlying philosophies were fundamentally incompatible. The Brotherhood, for all its flaws, had never articulated a plan to kill the wasteland's population. Its paternalism was the paternalism of people who believed others couldn't be trusted with powerful things, not the paternalism of people who believed others deserved to die. The story of Hakunin, the shaman of Arroyo, ran through the background of Fallout 2 like a quiet current. He appeared to the Chosen One in dreams during the journey, sharing visions of the village's deteriorating condition that added urgency to what might otherwise have felt like a purely external mission. The dream sequences were among the game's more atmospheric moments, using the language of vision and myth to communicate things that the ordinary dialogue systems could not quite reach. Hakunin was a healer and a keeper of Arroyo's spiritual traditions, a figure who understood the village's relationship to the land in terms that were not simply practical. His visions came from a genuine attunement to the community he served, a sensitivity to its well-being that manifested in ways that the modern worldview might have called mystical, but that the game presented as simply another form of knowledge. His distress as the village's situation worsened was not performed anxiety, but the specific grief of someone watching something he had dedicated his life to protecting begin to fail. The Elder of Arroyo carried her own complexity. She had sent the Chosen One out knowing the risks, knowing that the journey might consume the person who undertook it, knowing that the village's survival was worth that cost. This was not a decision she had made lightly, and the weight of it was visible in the few interactions the player could have with her. She understood the Vault Dweller's story not as a triumph, but as a transaction, a person who gave everything for something important and who received in return the bare fact of having done something necessary. She hoped the Chosen One would fare better, but she did not pretend the stakes were low. The Chosen One's character in Fallout 2 was defined more completely by the game's systems than by any predetermined personality. The special system, which governed attributes across the entire Fallout series, allowed the player to construct a protagonist who could approach the Wasteland's challenges in radically different ways. A character with high intelligence could talk their way through situations that a less verbal person would have to fight through. A character built around stealth could operate in locations that a more direct person would find impenetrable. A character with strong charisma could build relationships and gather companions in ways that reshaped the practical balance of dangerous encounters. This flexibility was not merely mechanical convenience. It was the game's central philosophical statement about how the wasteland worked. Success in Fallout 2 was not primarily a matter of having the biggest weapon or the most hit points. It was a matter of understanding contexts, of reading situations carefully enough to identify what they actually required, of applying the right kind of capability to the right kind of problem. The game rewarded intelligence and observation in ways that many games of its era did not, and this reward structure communicated something genuine about what it took to survive in a world where resources were genuinely scarce. Companions were an important dimension of the journey, both practically and narratively. Vic, the trader mechanic, was recovered from the den and brought his knowledge of the region's geography and his mechanical skills to the group. Cassidy, a wandering mercenary with a complicated personal history, offered fighting capability and a dry commentary on the wasteland's absurdities. Marcus, the super mutant, if recruited in Broken Hills, brought enormous physical capacity and the particular perspective of someone who had fought on multiple sides of the war and survived long enough to wonder what it had all been for. Sulik, a tribal warrior from a community south of Klamath, carried his own quest running beneath the main story, searching for a sister taken by slavers. The question of Jet was more than a drug plot. It was the game's mechanism for exploring how power maintains itself in environments where formal authority does not exist. The Mordino family had not invented Jet with particularly grand ambitions. They had identified a demand, found a supply, and organized a distribution network. The fact that the product was destroying the people who used it was in their calculus irrelevant. Demand was demand. In a world without regulatory structures, without a government capable of limiting what could be sold, or mandating warnings, or providing treatment for addiction, the market simply existed and people fell into it. The irony that Myron, the young scientist who had technically created Jet on behalf of the Mordinos, had no awareness of the Enclave's involvement in the compound's origins was a detail that the game embedded without calling excessive attention to it. Myron believed he was the author of something terrible, and he was, in the narrow sense that he had done the chemistry. But the deeper engineering of Jet, the selection of its specific properties, the manner in which it had been introduced to the region, those choices had been made in places Myron had never been by people who would not have acknowledged his existence. He was a pawn who thought he was a player. The cure for Jet addiction, buried in the quest lines associated with both Myron and the doctors at Vault City, was a mission thread that connected personal suffering to institutional indifference. Vault City had the medical capability to synthesize a treatment. They had no particular incentive to share it with the outside world. The Chosen One navigating this problem had to weigh the immediate benefit of solving jet addiction for specific individuals against the political calculations of dealing with an entity like Vault City, which gave nothing without expecting something in return. The Raiders of the Wasteland existed across Fallout 2 as a persistent background fact rather than a coherent antagonist. Different groups operated under different names and different organizational structures in different regions, but they shared a common economic logic. In a world without reliable agriculture, without stable trade networks, without the institutions that normally allow people to accumulate resources through productive work, raiding was one of the strategies available to people who were strong enough to take things and desperate enough to do it. The game did not romanticize this, but it did not entirely dehumanize it either. The Khans were the most historically significant raider group in Fallout 2, having emerged from the collapse of Vault 15's population and carried the memory of that origin in their name and their structure. They were a problem for the NCR, not simply because they raided settlements, which they did, but because their presence in a region the NCR wanted to incorporate made that incorporation significantly harder. The political math of expansion required that the territories being absorbed be safe enough for the people who joined to see the NCR as a protection rather than a competitor, and the Khans undermined that calculation. The village of Modoc sat on a farming route and presented a different kind of wasteland community than most of what the Chosen One encountered. It was genuinely rural in a way that even Arroyo, with its canyon isolation, was not, a settlement built around the growing of food and the peaceful management of daily life. The mysteries buried beneath Modoc were the kind of low-stakes horror that the game embedded in unlikely places, discoveries that did not connect to the main story, but that illuminated the ways that post-war communities developed their own secrets over time. The tanker that sat in the San Francisco Bay was one of the more memorable images in Fallout 2, a massive pre-war vessel that had been colonized by a community of people who had built their entire existence around it. The Hubologists had made the tanker their base of operations, a group whose theology was a deliberate and transparently satirical portrait of certain real-world religious movements that had attracted considerable public attention in the years before the game's release. Their belief system revolved around the idea that advanced technology could free the spirit from biological limitation, and their plan to refuel and launch the tanker into space was the practical expression of that belief. San Francisco itself, in Fallout 2's rendering, was a city that had survived the war in better physical condition than most, its geography and the particular trajectory of the strikes having spared it from the most complete devastation. Two major factions had made the city their home, the Hubologists and the Sher. The Sheas were descendants of a Chinese submarine crew that had been stranded in the bay when the war began, a community that had grown across generations from that unlikely origin into a sophisticated society with advanced botanical and chemical research capabilities. The Sher Emperor was a computer, the vessel's original navigation and command system that had been repurposed by successive generations into something approaching a governing authority. The Sher people maintained their relationship to this machine with a reverence that was not quite religious and not quite secular, but something in between, the product of generations of dependence on a system that had genuinely helped them survive. The computer's pronouncements were treated as guidance, its calculations as wisdom, its operational demands as civic obligation. The final approach to the Enclave was structured around the recovery of a vertibird fuel delivery system, a series of quests that required the Chosen One to gather components and resources scattered across the region before the tanker could be made seaworthy enough to reach the oil rig. This structure was the game's way of ensuring that the player had engaged with enough of the world before arriving at its conclusion, that the decision to destroy the Enclave came from someone who had seen what the Enclave's survival would mean for the people of New Reno and Vault City and Gecko and Arroyo. The oil rig itself was designed as a concentrated experience of everything the Enclave represented. Its corridors were clean in a way that nothing in the wasteland was. Its personnel moved with the practiced efficiency of an organization that had maintained discipline across decades of isolation. Its laboratories contained experiments that would have been disturbing in a peaceful world and were simply evidence of purpose in this one. The Chosen One, moving through those spaces, was encountering not just a military installation, but a vision of what the people inside it believed the future should look like. The rescue of Arroyo's kidnapped residents, who had been taken by Enclave soldiers and brought to the oil rig for use in the FEV modification experiments, gave the final sequence a personal urgency that the abstract horror of genocide could not quite supply on its own. The Elder was there. Hakunen's herbs and visions had brought the Chosen One to this moment, and the moment required that the survivors be found and led out before the platform's systems were triggered to destroy everything that remained. The destruction of the oil rig was not a clean victory in the way that some games offer. The Enclave as an organization was not ended by the destruction of its primary installation. Its ideology, the belief in the supremacy of the unirradiated, the willingness to define some human beings as not human enough to deserve survival, that ideology persisted in surviving members who dispersed across the wasteland. The ending slides of Fallout 2 acknowledge this implicitly, showing futures for the game's various settlements that were shaped by the Chosen One's actions, but that did not pretend the world had been made simply safe. The ending of Arroyo, when the GEC key was finally deployed in the village's soil, was rendered with the quiet satisfaction of something that had been worth the effort. The crops grew, the water became cleaner. The people who had sent their best person into a dangerous world because they had no other option watched the land respond to what the device contained and understood that the cost of the journey had been, in this specific transaction, worth it. The Chosen One returned to a village that was still small, still perched in its canyon, still far from the centers of regional power. But it was alive, and it had a future. The broader implications of the game's events rippled outward through the ending slides in ways that made Fallout 2 feel like a genuine history rather than a story. The NCR's expansion continued, shaped by what had happened in Vault 15 and Redding and the Den. Vault City's position became more complicated as the realities of regional politics pressed in on its carefully maintained isolation. New Reno's families adjusted to new power balances based on which alliances had been made and which enemies had been cleared. Each location had not simply been a quest location, but a community with a trajectory, and the game honored those trajectories by following them to their conclusions. Marcus leaving Broken Hills to search for surviving Unity members in the West was a detail that planted a seed for the later Fallout series, connecting the world of the second game to what would eventually appear in Fallout New Vegas and beyond. The super mutant community's dispersal after the mine's uranium ran out was presented without sentimentality, but also without contempt, the end of something that had been genuinely worthwhile while it lasted. The development history of Fallout 2 is a story that runs parallel to its lore and casts light on both. The game was created by Black Isle Studios under enormous pressure, with a development window that most of the team understood was insufficient for what they were trying to build. The original Fallout creators had largely departed by the time serious work began, and the team that remained made the choice to interpret that departure as an opportunity rather than a loss. They took the framework they had inherited and pushed it in directions that were sometimes broader and sometimes stranger than what had come before. The game was larger than its predecessor by design, built on the explicit mandate that it needed to be approximately 50% bigger in terms of content and world. Achieving that target in the available time required decisions about what to include and what to abandon, and some of the most interesting features that were planned did not survive those decisions. Several towns and story elements were designed but not implemented, victims of the schedule rather than failures of imagination. The game was shipped with bugs that the team knew about but could not fully address in the time available, and some of those bugs had effects on ending slides that changed the outcomes players received from the ones the writers had intended. Tim Kane's departure from the project before its completion was a loss that the remaining developers acknowledged privately while demonstrating through the finished game that his absence had not been fatal. The team found its own voice in Fallout 2, one that was perhaps less controlled and more willing to indulge the absurd edges of the setting than the first game had been. The pop culture references and the fourth wall adjacent humor that appeared in certain parts of the game were divisive responses, with some players finding them a welcome lightness in a dark world, and others finding them a tonal inconsistency that broke immersion. The special system, as it appeared in Fallout 2, represented an expansion of the original game's mechanics that gave players significantly more granular control over how their character developed. The seven core attributes strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck were each more consequential here than in the first game, with their effects rippling through skill calculations, dialogue options, and the reactions of the world's inhabitants in ways that rewarded both planning and experimentation. Perks were the system that most completely expressed Fallout 2's approach to character building. The idea that your character was not simply a collection of numbers, but a specific kind of person with specific capabilities shaped by specific experiences. Every few levels, the player selected a perk that modified how their character interacted with the world in ways that could not be fully captured by skill point allocation alone. Some perks opened entirely new dialogue options. Some made certain types of combat more effective. Some had effects that were subtle enough to be easily missed, but that became significant over the course of a long playthrough. The karma and reputation systems in Fallout 2 created a social world that responded to the player's choices in ways that felt more organic than a simple points-based evaluation. Different settlements and factions tracked their own relationships with the Chosen One independently, meaning that an action that improved standing with the NCR might simultaneously damage a relationship with a group that opposed NCR expansion. These intersecting reputations created a form of social complexity that matched the game's themes about faction and loyalty and the difficulty of acting well in a world where most significant choices had costs. The wasteland ecology of Fallout 2's California was one of its most carefully considered environmental achievements. The mutations that had affected the region's flora and fauna since the war were rendered with a specificity that made them feel like the products of genuine biological processes rather than simply decorative strangeness. Brahmin were everywhere because they were useful, and their ubiquity reflected the ecological logic of a world where large, relatively tractable animals with multiple food and labor outputs would be disproportionately valuable. Rad scorpions occupied the same defensive, ecological niches that scorpions had always occupied, amplified in scale and lethality by the same pressures that had transformed most of the living world. Gecko ghouls were one of the more thoughtful biological details in the game's regional ecology. The standard ghouls of the wasteland, including the residents of the gecko settlement, were human survivors of radiation exposure who had been transformed in ways that extended their lifespans while altering their physiology significantly. The feral ghouls encountered as enemies in various locations were a reminder that the transformation was not uniformly benign, that some who had been exposed had lost the cognitive capacity to remain social in any meaningful sense while retaining the physical durability that radiation had granted. The Night Stalker creatures, the various mutant predators that populated the wilderness between settlements, existed in Fallout 2 as constant reminders that the wilderness was genuinely dangerous rather than merely aesthetically threatening. Travel between locations required resource management and attention to the risks of random encounters, a design choice that kept the world feeling inhabited and hazardous in a way that purely landmark based travel would not have achieved. The relationship between Fallout 2 and the concept of karma was not simply mechanical, but genuinely thematic, a meditation on the question of what ethical behavior looks like in an environment where conventional ethics have been stripped of their institutional supports. The wasteland had no courts, no police forces capable of reaching everywhere, no reliable social consequences for most forms of harm. What it had was the accumulated weight of reputation, the way that communities talk to each other across the distances of the map, and the internal accounting that the player character carried, regardless of what the external world could see. The Chosen One could become many different kinds of person over the course of the game. They could be a champion of communities, someone who cleared threats and solved problems and left settlements better than they found them. They could be a figure of fear, someone whose willingness to use force and whose indifference to who got hurt made the wasteland more dangerous. They could be an operator, moving between factions without strong loyalty to any of them, collecting favors and information and resources with the practical efficiency of a very good trader. The game did not insist on any of these as the correct approach, but it tracked which one you were choosing and adjusted the world's response accordingly. The concept of tribal identity that the game introduced through Arroyo and expanded through the encounters with various communities across the map was a careful observation about how human beings construct meaning and belonging in the absence of larger institutional structures. The tribal ceremony, the ritual of the coming of age test, the reverence for the ancestors' journal, these were not primitive superstitions, but genuine social technologies, mechanisms for creating and maintaining the shared identity that makes cooperation possible. The post-war world had not abandoned human nature. It had given that nature a new set of materials to work with. Fallout 2's place in the broader Fallout timeline was more significant than a simple sequel relationship might suggest. The events of the game shaped the world that later entries in the series would inherit in ways that were fundamental rather than incidental. The new California Republic that dominated Fallout New Vegas's political landscape was the direct descendant of the organization that the Chosen One had helped stabilize and expand. The details of the first Vault Dweller's life, filled in by Fallout 2's framing story, gave the series a biographical depth that connected the player's actions in the first game to the world of the second. The Enclave, having survived the destruction of the oil rig in scattered form, would appear again in Fallout 3 on the East Coast, carrying the same ideology into a new geography. Their presence in that later game made more sense understood against the background of their defeat in California, as the remnant of an organization that had been broken but not ended, continuing to believe in its mission even after the institutional structure that had housed that mission had been destroyed. The vertibirds that the Enclave used in Fallout 3 were descendants of the same technology that had appeared so ominously in Fallout 2's opening cinematic. Marcus, who left Broken Hills at the game's conclusion to search for surviving Unity members in the West, would eventually be found in Fallout New Vegas near Jacobstown, a mountain community of super mutants who had created a refuge where their kind could live without constant conflict. His presence there, older and more reflective than ever, carried the weight of everything he had seen from the Unity's defeat through the events of Fallout 2 and beyond, a living record of the series' history preserved in an aging mutant's carefully maintained patience. The philosophical questions embedded in Fallout 2's lore were not decorative. They were the engine that drove the game's emotional resonance, the reason that a story about a tribal person looking for a gardening device could sustain 100 hours of engagement without exhausting its depth. The central question was one that the first Fallout had introduced, and that the second explored from more angles, which was the question of what humanity means when the civilization that has historically defined humanity is gone. The Enclave's answer to this question was genetic. Humanity was a biological category, defined by the absence of radiation induced mutation, and everything that had been exposed was something other than human, regardless of how it thought, or felt, or behaved. This answer had the advantage of clarity and the disadvantage of requiring the murder of almost everyone alive. The NCR's implicit answer was institutional. Humanity was something you built and maintained through systems of law and governance and social obligation, and the Republic was humanity's current best expression, even in its imperfect form. The tribal communities like Arroyo offered a third answer, one organized around continuity and memory and the practices that kept a community connected to its origins. None of these answers was presented as simply correct. The game was careful to show the costs and the limitations of each. The NCR's institutional humanity was subject to the same corruption and inefficiency that had undermined human institutions throughout history. The tribal answer depended on the survival of specific memories and specific places in ways that made it fragile. Even the Enclave's answer, as monstrous as its implementation was, came from a genuine desire to preserve something real, however disastrously they had identified what that something was. The texture of daily life in Fallout 2's settlements was one of the game's enduring contributions to the series. Each community had developed specific economic practices, specific social hierarchies, specific relationships to the technology they possessed and the technology they lacked. Vault City's medical clinics and their carefully rationed services were a concentrated image of how advanced capability creates new forms of inequality when it is not distributed but controlled. New Reno's economy of vice was a specific form of the more general observation that human desires do not disappear in catastrophe, but find new expressions within new constraints. The water merchants who traveled between settlements, trading the most basic of necessities, were part of a logistical infrastructure that the game rendered as background detail, but that represented genuine economic thinking about post-war survival. Water purification technology had become one of the region's most valuable commodities for the same reason it had always been valuable. Life required it. The communities that could produce it had leverage over the ones that could not, a dynamic that Vault City's origins and Vault 8's water purification technology illustrated in concentrated form. The caravan routes that connected the game's various locations were not simply gameplay conveniences, but representations of the economic interdependency that was gradually knitting the wasteland's communities together into something that might eventually become a regional civilization. The NCR was the most advanced expression of this tendency, but even outside the NCR's borders, the same logic was operating, the same recognition that isolation was a form of vulnerability, and that trade, however imperfect, was better than self-sufficiency. The moment of the Chosen One's confrontation with Frank Horrigan at the oil rig was one of the game's most kinetically charged encounters, but its emotional weight came from everything that had accumulated before it. By the time the player reached Horrigan, they had spent hours in a world that Horrigan and the Enclave were planning to kill. The people of Arroyo who had been kidnapped and brought to the platform were somewhere in those corridors. The Elder's trust, Hakunen's visions, the investments of every companion who had made the journey, these were the emotional stakes that made the mechanical challenge of the fight, meaningful rather than simply difficult. The ending of the oil rig's systems and the escape of the survivors through the platform's corridors as the structure destabilized was structured as a race against the consequences of a decision the Chosen One had made. This was the game's final test of the qualities that the journey had demanded: the ability to move quickly and decisively under pressure, to keep track of what mattered, to not lose the people who were depending on you in the chaos of an ending that was not neatly controlled. The vertibird that carried the survivors away from the oil rig as it collapsed behind them was the closest thing the game offered to triumph. The ending slides of Fallout 2 were not a celebration. They were a reckoning, a systematic accounting of what the Chosen One's choices had made possible and what they had failed to prevent. Some communities had been helped in ways that produced good futures. Some had been helped in ways that produced futures that were better but still complicated. Some had been left to their own devices and had arrived at outcomes that reflected that absence. The game did not pretend that good intentions reliably produced good results, or that the most heroic possible choices guaranteed the most positive possible outcomes. The NCR's continued expansion was presented as genuinely good for the stability of the region, while also being genuinely concerning in its implications for the smaller communities that would eventually be absorbed or marginalized by it. Power always does this. The republic that represented the best available option for regional governance also represented the kind of scale at which governance begins to serve itself as much as the people it claims to represent. The ending slides acknowledge this without resolving it, because it was the kind of tension that does not resolve in a generation. Arroyo's future, with the GECK deployed and the land beginning to recover its capacity for growth, was the closest the game came to a genuinely hopeful note. The village that had sent its chosen person into a dangerous world and waited had received something real in return. The crops would grow. The children of the people who had prayed for this would grow up in a place that could feed them. This was not the end of difficulty or danger or the larger questions that the wasteland still posed, but it was enough to go on with, and in Fallout 2's moral economy, enough to go on with was as much as anyone could honestly ask for. The legacy of Fallout 2 within the game series it helped it define was one of the more interesting conversations in the history of the medium. The game had been made under circumstances that should not have produced anything remarkable and had produced something that many players considered the high point of the original RPG format. A game whose combination of moral complexity, world-building depth, and mechanical flexibility had rarely been matched in the decades since its release. The darker and more satirical tone of Fallout 2, its willingness to engage with difficult social themes through the lens of a world stripped of civilization's polite fictions, had become a touchstone for a certain vision of what the Fallout series should be. The new California Republic, whose foundations the game laid with such care, would eventually become the primary political entity of the West Coast wasteland, providing the backdrop for Fallout New Vegas's political conflicts a decade later in game time and a decade later in real time as well. The Chosen One's story did not end with the game's final slide. They lived on in the world they had helped shape, in the settlements that had been improved or damaged by their presence, in the political structures that bore the marks of their interventions, in the people who carried the memory of a wanderer from the canyon country who had come through their community and left it different. The Vault Dweller had wandered north and founded a village. The Chosen One had wandered south and found a world. Both had left it slightly more inhabitable than they had found it, which was in the end the only thing the wasteland ever asked of anyone. There is a quality to the best wasteland stories that resists easy summarization, a texture of accumulated detail and quiet observation that makes the world feel inhabited rather than merely imagined. Fallout 2 had this quality in abundance, built from hundreds of small decisions about what a post-nuclear California would actually look like, how the people living in it would actually speak and organize and argue and cooperate, what they would remember of the world before, and what they would have invented to replace what was lost. The canyon of Arroyo remained in its geography, unchanged by the events of the game. The rock formations that had sheltered the tribe through 80 years of wasteland history, continuing to stand against the wind as they had always stood. The crops that grew from Gek treated soil were the same crops the Vault Dweller's Journal had described planting in the early years of the village's existence, varieties that had been chosen for resilience and adapted over generations to the specific conditions of that specific ground. The evening fires where the stories were told still burned, and now there were new stories to tell, stories about a journey south and the things that had been found there and the cost at which they had been obtained. The wasteland did not become simple after Fallout 2's events. It did not become safe. The NCR continued to expand and to make the compromises that expansion required. New Reno continued to be what it had always been. The ghouls and the humans and the super mutants of the various communities continued to navigate the tensions that their cohabitation created, some of them finding ways forward and some of them failing. The world went on being what it was, which was hard and complicated and occasionally beautiful and never quite finished. Somewhere in the evening quiet, the sound of the wasteland settling into itself, the distant call of creatures that had no name in the old world's taxonomies, the soft percussion of wind against salvaged walls, there was something that felt, if not like peace, then at least like the absence of the worst things. And that was, in the lore of Fallout 2, what hope sounded like. The Chosen One's name was not recorded in any official document. The NCR's archives, which were the most comprehensive record-keeping system in the region by the time those archives were assembled, contained references to the events of the oil rig's destruction without preserving the identity of the person who had made it possible. This was not an oversight, but a reflection of how history actually works in the absence of institutions designed to preserve individual stories. The large events get recorded. The people who made them happen become, over time, a kind of category, the hero of the particular moment, the wanderer from the canyon. Hakunen's dreams had shown the Chosen One the path to the oil rig before the path was fully visible, and after the journey was complete, those dreams stopped. The shaman who had served as the village's spiritual antenna returned to the daily practice of healing and ceremony, his visions no longer reaching across the distance between Arroyo and the structures of power that had threatened it. The link that the crisis had created between his sensitivity and the larger world's movements closed, and he was again simply what he had always been, a keeper of a small community's connection to its own meaning. The world of Fallout 2 was finally a world that believed in the possibility of improvement without pretending that improvement was inevitable or easy or clean. Its communities were trying. Its people were working toward futures they could not fully see, guided by values that had been assembled from the wreckage of a civilization that had destroyed itself through its inability to take seriously the costs of its own choices. The lesson was not that humanity was doomed to repeat its mistakes. The lesson was that the margin between repetition and change was thin, and that it required constant attention from people who were willing to pay it. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the device that the whole journey had been organized around, was a piece of pre-war technology designed by people who had understood, at some level, that the world they were building might not survive. Someone at Vault-Tec had thought through what it would take to rebuild agriculture from nothing, had assembled the components of that rebuilding into a portable package, and had included one in every vault as standard equipment. This was either extraordinary foresight or an acknowledgement of guilt, the recognition that the civilization building those bombs knew what it was risking and chose to prepare for the worst rather than prevent it. The canyon still held the village still held the memory, and the memory, carried forward in the careful repetition of ceremony and story, held the understanding that survival was not simply biological but moral, that staying alive long enough to matter required knowing what you were staying alive for. That understanding, fragile and honest and hard won, was the inheritance the vault dweller had left to Arroyo, and that Arroyo had sent back out into the world in the form of a chosen one who had found a way to justify the name. The fires burned low in the canyon as the wasteland settled into another of its ancient nights, and the stars above California were the same stars that had watched all of this happen, indifferent and bright and very, very old. And in the hush that followed, there was room to rest and to let the long story of Fallout 2 close softly over everything, like dust over ruins, like sky over the last light of a day that had been difficult and necessary and, in its particular way, enough. The story of how Vault 15's diverse population fractured after its doors opened deserves closer attention than the main quest provides. When the Vault's residents had lived together through the sealed years, they had managed the tensions of their deliberately designed diversity through necessity and proximity. The Vault's designers had, true to the general Vault Tech philosophy, selected a population that would have difficulty maintaining social cohesion, mixing people of genuinely incompatible political and cultural backgrounds, and sealing them together to observe the results. The fact that they had survived the sealed period at all was a tribute to human adaptability rather than an endorsement of the experiment. When the vault opened, the pressures that had been contained by the walls reasserted themselves with the added force of all the years they had been suppressed. Groups formed around the affiliations they had brought with them or had developed in the vault, and the greater world outside provided the space they needed to separate. Some moved toward what would become the foundations of the NCR, drawn by the practical appeal of organization and the ideological memory of democratic governance. Others found the freedom of the wasteland more appealing than any structure, and their children would eventually form the raider gangs that bore family names across the region. The original Vault 15 location became a layered archaeological site of the wasteland's social history. The squat that occupied it by the time of Fallout 2's events was several generations removed from the Vault's original population, squatters who had built their marginal community over the Vault's entrance without necessarily understanding what was beneath them. Below the squat was the Vault's still-sealed lower levels, containing computer records that the NCR wanted and the cons were using as a base. The 3 layers of occupation told the story of a century of post-war California compressed into a single geographic point. The Hubologists of San Francisco were the game's most extended satirical portrait, a community whose theology was rendered with enough specific detail to be unmistakably pointed without quite crossing into defamation of actual living organizations. Their belief system held that humanity had once been star travelers, beings of far greater spiritual capacity than the current form allowed, and that advanced technology could unlock the pathways back to that original state. They had an elaborate hierarchy of spiritual advancement, ranks achieved through rituals and assessments that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to certain real-world organizational structures. What made the Hubologists interesting beyond their satirical function was the genuine emotional need that their theology addressed. The post-war world was one in which the most powerful explanatory frameworks people had previously used to understand their lives had been severely tested. The idea that human civilization represented progress, that the accumulated work of history was moving towards something better, had become very hard to maintain standing in the ruins of what that civilization had produced. Into this vacuum, the Hubologists had introduced a framework that explained the disaster as an interruption rather than an endpoint, that placed the wasteland's suffering in a larger narrative of cosmic return. Their plan to launch a repaired tanker as the first step of a journey to the stars was not simply delusional. It was the expression of a genuine yearning, the desire to escape a world that had been broken beyond simple repair, to reach something outside the atmosphere of consequences where a new beginning might actually be possible. The chosen one could help them fuel the tanker without endorsing their theology, using their organizational capacity and their control of the bay as a practical resource while remaining agnostic about their cosmological claims. The Shi of San Francisco maintained a more grounded relationship to technology and to their own origins. The Chinese submarine crew, who had been their founders, had been stranded in the bay by a war that had ended while they were underwater, surfacing into a world that had no place for them. Their survival had required immediate practical improvisation, the conversion of the submarine into a refuge, the establishment of water and food sources, the gradual building of connections to the surviving populations of the city above. The skills that had made them effective military personnel, their discipline, and their technical competence, and their ability to function in confined and hostile environments, had become the foundations of a civilian community. The sheer Emperor computer had grown into its governance role gradually as the submarine's systems were repurposed and as subsequent generations found that the computer's dispassionate processing of information produced better guidance than purely human political contestation. The Sheer people had developed a relationship to their machine emperor that combined practical deference with genuine reverence, not quite the worship of a god, but something more than the use of a tool. The computer had been there longer than anyone alive. It remembered things that no living person did. Its advice had been right often enough that doubting it felt like ingratitude. The Shai's botanical and chemical research represented a different model of post-war technological development than anything else in the region. While the Brotherhood hoarded technology and the Enclave developed weapons, the Shir had directed their considerable capabilities toward the life sciences, toward understanding how the mutated organisms of the New World worked and what they contained that might be useful. Their gardens were among the most carefully maintained biological environments in California, a quiet pride that expressed itself in the quality of their medicines and the variety of their cultivated species. The relationship between the new California Republic and the other settlements of the region was the political substrate underlying much of the game's activity. The NCR was not simply an expansionist power in the conventional military sense. It grew primarily through invitation and economic integration, offering the infrastructure of governance, trade protection, currency stability, and dispute resolution to communities that found those services valuable enough to accept the obligations of membership. This model of expansion was slower and messier than conquest, but produced a more durable form of incorporation. The NCR's military was a genuine army rather than a raider band, organized and equipped and operating under something recognizable as rules of engagement. This did not make it incapable of causing harm, as any military can cause harm, but it meant that the NCR's soldiers were generally accountable to an institutional structure that raider groups were not. Veterans of NCR campaigns had a career path that extended beyond the campaigns themselves, a pension system, and a civic identity that made military service part of a larger social contract rather than simply a means of acquiring what violence could take. President Tandy's relationship with the Vault Dweller had been formative in ways that she rarely discussed directly, but that shaped her politics throughout her tenure. She had been a child when the wanderer from the vault had come to Shady Sands, and the experience of being kidnapped by the Khans and rescued had given her a visceral understanding of what the absence of protection felt like and what its presence was worth. Her commitment to building an institution that could genuinely protect people, not just in the moment of acute crisis, but in the sustained way that allowed communities to plan for the future, was rooted in that early experience. Cassidy one of the Chosen One's potential companions, carried a history that exemplified the kind of individual story the wasteland generated in abundance. He was a former caravan guard who had settled in the town of Vault City's outlying area after a career that had taken him across the region. His medical condition, a heart problem that made stimulants genuinely dangerous for him, was one of the game's more memorable companion details, a vulnerability that required the player to manage companion equipment with some attention. His dry commentary on the wasteland and its inhabitants was among the wittiest companion dialogue in the game. Vic's story was simpler, but no less resonant. He had been a trader and mechanic in the Klamath area before his enslavement in the Den, and his restoration to freedom was one of the first genuinely good things the Chosen One could accomplish on the journey south. His mechanical skills were practical assets, and his knowledge of the region's geography and social dynamics made him a valuable source of information about what lay ahead. He was also simply grateful in a way that complicated the purely transactional relationship that the game might otherwise have established between companion and protagonist. Sulik's search for his sister, taken by slavers operating in the region south of Klamath, was a mission thread that the game introduced and then left somewhat unresolved, a reflection of the development pressures that had forced certain story elements to remain incomplete. But the incompleteness itself communicated something true about the wasteland, that not every search ended in recovery, that some people were lost to the system of exploitation and never found their way back. The economic geography of Fallout 2's California was carefully constructed to reflect genuine principles of how post-war economies would likely develop. The settlements closest to water sources had agricultural advantages that translated into political power. The communities that sat on natural trade routes accumulated more commerce than those that required detours to reach. The groups that possessed technical knowledge, whether medical, mechanical, or agricultural, had leverage over those that needed that knowledge and could not obtain it elsewhere. Redding's gold was valuable not primarily as jewelry or decoration, but as a medium of exchange, the property that made it useful being its relative scarcity, its durability, and its recognizability. The NCR had been working to establish a currency backed by this gold, an attempt to create the kind of monetary stability that would allow more complex economic relationships to develop across the region. Without a reliable medium of exchange, every transaction required barter, which was inefficient and limited the scale at which economic cooperation could occur. The drug economy centered in New Reno was the negative image of this productive development, an economic system that extracted value from its participants without creating the conditions for further growth. Jet addiction consumed the productive capacity of its users, transferring resources to the Mordinos and their suppliers, while leaving the addicted population less capable of generating the kind of sustained effort that building things required. The Enclave's original involvement in Jet's creation had understood this dynamic and had intended it precisely. The question of what the Enclave had been doing during the decades of its offshore isolation was one that the game answered through its laboratories and its records, rather than through direct exposition. The forced evolutionary virus research had continued throughout this period, building on the pre-war experiments that had created the supermutant armies of the first game while pursuing a different endpoint. The Master had used FEV to create soldiers. The Enclave was using it to create a cleanser, a pathogen that could be released into the atmosphere and that would target the genetic markers of radiation exposure while leaving unirradiated human beings unaffected. The scientific work required to achieve this modification was substantial, and it had consumed significant Enclave research resources across multiple administrations. President Richardson was not the first Enclave president to pursue this plan. It had been a strategic objective through several presidencies, adjusted and refined as the available science permitted, delayed by technical challenges and resource constraints and the occasional internal dissent from researchers who retained enough connection to conventional ethics to object. By the time the chosen one arrived at the oil rig, the work was close enough to completion that the plan was moving from research phase to operational phase. The human test subjects that the Enclave had acquired over the years, including the kidnapped residents of Arroyo by the game's end, were part of a research program that the Enclave scientists had sanitized through the language of necessity. The subjects were already compromised, in the Enclave's view. Their radiation exposure had placed them outside the category of human beings whose welfare required consideration. This logic, once accepted at any level, had no natural stopping point, because the same reasoning that justified using some people as research subjects could justify using anyone the Enclave chose to define as subhuman. The vertibirds that appeared in Fallout 2's opening cinematic and that the Enclave used for transport and operations were among the most technologically impressive artifacts in the wasteland. These tilt-rotor aircraft, capable of vertical takeoff and landing as well as high-speed horizontal flight, represented a category of military technology that no wasteland faction had managed to independently replicate. The Brotherhood of Steel could maintain some pre-war aircraft, but not at the operational level the Enclave achieved. The NCR had no air capability at all during this period. The Shire of San Francisco had developed their own interest in vertibird technology, and the quest to steal vertibird plans from either the Shi or the Enclave for use in fueling the tanker was one of the late-game threads that connected San Francisco's factions to the oil rig approach. The plans themselves were not simply blueprints, but encoded technical documentation that required the kind of mechanical and aeronautical expertise that few people in the wasteland possessed. The Shire had wanted them for reasons connected to their own research and development ambitions, and the Enclave had them because vertibirds were standard Enclave military equipment. The fuel needed to operate the tanker had connections to the same infrastructure that maintained vertibird operations, an overlap that made the tanker mission and the oil rig mission practically connected in ways that the game's quest structure reflected. The Chosen One moving through San Francisco was not simply preparing for one assault, but assembling the pieces of a multi-part operation that required coordination across different locations and different factions. The ghouls who populated various locations throughout the game represented one of the more complex demographic facts of post-war California. They were human beings who had survived the initial nuclear exchanges through circumstances that had altered them in ways that extended their potential lifespan enormously while marking them as visibly different from baseline humanity. Some ghouls who appeared in Fallout 2 were potentially very old, their bodies having maintained function for decades beyond what would have been biologically possible before the war. The prejudice that ghouls faced was not a simple hatred of difference. It was at its roots a fear of what they represented, which was the visible evidence of what the bombs had done to human biology. Every ghoul was a walking testament to the transformation that radiation could cause, and for people who had managed to maintain the illusion that the world might still return to something like normality, that testimony was unwelcome. The irony that ghouls' extended lifespans gave them knowledge and experience that could genuinely benefit communities was an irony that prejudice rarely permitted to surface in the normal course of events. The Gecko settlement had developed a social culture that combined the particular resilience of people who had learned to expect hostility with the specific pleasures of a community that had found ways to enjoy itself anyway. The bars and informal gathering spaces of Gecko were lived in a way that Vault City's carefully maintained facilities were not, bearing the marks of actual use by people who were not performing respectability, but simply existing in their own space. The confrontation between this quality of life and Vault City's sterile superiority was one of the game's most pointed observations about the relationship between privilege and humanity. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in the Fallout 2 region was more peripheral than it would be in the later games, but its institutional character was already fully formed. The Brotherhood in this period was in the process of developing the internal tensions that would eventually fracture it in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. The disagreement between those who believed that their mission of technological preservation required strict secrecy and those who believed that the wasteland's suffering demanded more active engagement. The individual Brotherhood members the Chosen One encountered were generally competent and often personally decent, the products of an organization that maintained high training standards and a genuine internal ethic, even when that ethic was poorly calibrated to the needs of the world outside its bunkers. The paladins who had been assigned to field operations understood more about the wasteland's realities than the scholars who remained in the Lost Hills facility, and some of them had developed perspectives that chafed against the organization's institutional conservatism. The contrast between the Brotherhood and the Enclave on the question of technology's purpose was one that the game embedded in the background rather than foregrounding. Both organizations had superior technology relative to most of the wasteland. The Brotherhood used its technology to defend itself and occasionally to assist communities that it found worthy. The Enclave used its technology as an instrument of a plan that would have destroyed almost every community the Brotherhood had ever interacted with. The difference was not in capability, but in intention, and intention was the variable that the game most consistently asked its players to evaluate. The settlements of Northern California that the Chosen One passed through had developed their own methods for marking the passage of time in a world that had lost the institutional framework of the pre-war calendar. Religious and quasi-religious observances served this function in some communities, their ceremonies anchoring the year to seasonal cycles in ways that the pre-war calendar had done by convention, and these new practices did by accumulated meaning. Arroyo's tribal ceremonies were the most elaborate example, but smaller versions of the same practice existed in most of the game's settlements. The concept of the elder, present in various forms across multiple communities, was the game's recognition that post-war societies had developed a reverence for lived experience, yet and its preservation that the pre-war world had not uniformly maintained. In a world without books or films or formal education systems in most places, the memory held by long-lived individuals was the primary vehicle for the transmission of knowledge across generations. The politics of this situation were not simple, since elders could preserve wisdom or prejudice with equal fidelity, but the function itself was genuine, and the communities that neglected it paid costs that those which honored it did not. The Chosen One's age and relative inexperience at the journey's beginning was one of the game's quieter investments in the premise of growth. By the end of the story, the character who returned to Arroyo was not the same person who had left it. The Temple of Trials had been a test of what the candidate already was. The journey south had been a transformation, the education that the trial had prepared the person to receive. The question of memory in Fallout 2 was a question that the game explored through its relationship with the first game's events, as much as through its own narrative. The Chosen One was the grandchild, in some accounts, of the Vault Dweller, a person living 80 years in the shadow of someone who had become a legend within living memory of the oldest village residents. The gap between the living person and the legendary ancestor was navigated differently by different characters in the game, some treating the Chosen One as a direct continuation of that legendary figure, and others treating the family connection as coincidental rather than determinative. The Vault Dweller's journal itself was one of the game's most significant documents, a text that existed within the fiction as both historical record and family artifact. It preserved a first-person voice, the specific perspective of one person's experience, against the tendency of time to smooth individual stories into categorical ones. The vault dweller had not been a symbol when they had written those pages. They had been a person, confused and determined and frequently uncertain, doing something difficult just in conditions that did not reliably support success. The journal preserved that humanity against the legend, Hakunen's ability to reach the Chosen One in dreams across the distances of the journey, raised questions that the game answered in the language of the tribal and the spiritual rather than the scientific. Whether his visions were genuinely prophetic or whether they were the product of a powerful emotional bond expressing itself in the dreaming mind of someone who carried that community's hopes, the game left ambiguous. What was not ambiguous was their effect, which was to keep Arroyo present in the Chosen One's awareness through the most distracting and demanding portions of the journey, a thread connecting the individual to the community even when the individual was furthest from home. The final stretch of Fallout 2's story, from the assembly of the tanker's requirements through the oil rig approach and the escape from its destruction, compressed the game's various thematic threads into their most concentrated form. The Chosen One who arrived at the oil rig was carrying the weight of every choice that had been made since leaving Arroyo, every community that had been helped or abandoned, every ally that had been made or lost, every piece of information that had been gathered about what the Enclave actually intended. The oil rig's physical design communicated the Enclave's self-image with every corridor. Everything was functional and clean and maintained with a precision that the wasteland never managed. The personnel moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had never experienced the chaos of the settlements outside the platform's walls. There was something genuinely impressive about what the Enclave had preserved, the operational capability of a pre-war military installation maintained across decades of isolation through sheer institutional will. The tragedy was that this impressive preservation served a plan that would have made the wasteland's suffering permanent rather than temporary. The survivors of Arroyo who had been brought to the oil rig for the Enclave's experiments were found in conditions that told the story of how the Enclave regarded them without requiring any further explanation. They were alive because the experiments required living subjects, but they were there as instruments rather than as people. Finding them and leading them out was the mission's most personal dimension, the retrieval of the specific human beings whose kidnapping had made the plan concrete rather than abstract. The world that the Chosen One left behind them when the vertibird carried the survivors away from the oil rig's collapsing structure was not a simplified world. The Enclave's defeat had removed the immediate catastrophic threat, but the conditions that had made the Enclave possible, the inequalities and the prejudices and the struggles over resources and power, those conditions persisted in the settlements that the ending slides described. The NCR was growing and would continue to grow. The ghouls and humans and supermutants of the various communities would continue to negotiate their cohabitations. The drug trade would continue to find buyers. What had changed was the removal of the immediate terminus, the point at which all of those complicated ongoing developments would have been ended by a pathogen released from an aircraft the Enclave no longer possessed. The future that the Wasteland's communities were building together, however imperfectly and contentiously, had been given more time to build. Whether they would use that time well was not something the game could promise, but something it could only hope, and it expressed that hope through the details of the ending slides, the small futures that the Chosen One's actions had made more possible. The canyon of Arroyo, with its new crops and its recovering land, was the game's final image of what the hope looked like in practice, specific and small and sufficient. The largest threats required large responses, but the reasons for making those responses were always local and personal, rooted in the specific places and specific people that the wanderer carried in their memory while making the difficult decisions that the journey required. The wasteland does not end. It continues past the edges of every story told about it, past the closing slides and the final credits, past the last fire of the evening, and into the next morning's uncertain light. The stories that survive are the ones worth carrying forward, and Fallout 2 was one of those stories, careful and honest, and built from the understanding that the world, however broken, was worth the effort of trying to understand it. The question of what it meant to be the chosen one was one that the village had answered before the person who carried the title had any say in the matter. Being chosen is not the same as choosing, and that gap between designation and self determination was something the chosen one navigated across the entire length of the journey. The tribal community of Arroyo had invested its hopes in a specific individual because it had no other options, because the circumstances of the crisis had converged on this person at this moment in a way that felt like destiny, even when it was simply the intersection of need and proximity and the qualities that this particular person happened to possess. The chosen one's freedom to be something other than what the title required was expressed through the game's systems more completely than through its narrative. The narrative gave them a mission and a name and a community that depended on them. The systems gave them the ability to be a different kind of person than the mission description suggested, to approach the wasteland's problems with selfishness or cruelty or casual indifference to the communities that the framing story presented as worthy of care. This tension between the imposed identity and the player's agency was one of the ways the game engaged honestly with the question it was raising, because being chosen does not automatically make you good. The ending in which Arroyo survived and thrived was not the only possible ending. The game tracked choices and their consequences with enough fidelity that a chosen one who had made very different decisions would have returned to a different kind of situation, or would not have returned at all. The range of possible outcomes was part of the game's argument that the wasteland's future was genuinely contingent on the choices of the people moving through it, that history was not a mechanism running toward a predetermined destination, but a process that the participants were shaping through each individual decision. The long-term consequences of the events of Fallout 2 extended forward through the series' timeline in ways that the game's designers could not entirely have anticipated. The world they built in Northern California became the foundation on which subsequent games constructed their own versions of the wasteland's future, each one building on the political and geographic and demographic details that Fallout 2 had established. The new California Republic that appears as the dominant Western power in Fallout New Vegas is the direct institutional descendant of the organization that the Chosen One helped stabilize, its expansion northward into Nevada, the fulfillment of tendencies visible in the game's ending slides. The Enclave's persistence beyond its oil rig defeat, its appearance on the East Coast in Fallout 3 carrying the same ideology in a different geography, was a reminder that ideas do not die with the institutions that house them. The survivors of the oil rig's destruction, scattered across the wasteland and eventually regrouping in research facilities that appear in later games, carried the Enclave's self-image and its conviction with them into new territory. The defeat at the end of Fallout 2 was a defeat of capability rather than of belief, and belief proved more durable than the platform it had occupied. The Shi of San Francisco continued their biological research in the aftermath of the oil rig's destruction, their knowledge of the mutated organisms of the new California ecosystem becoming an increasingly valuable resource as the NCR's expansion brought more communities into contact with one another and created new demands for medical and agricultural knowledge. Their founding story, the stranded submarine crew that had built a civilization from the materials of catastrophe, was one of the more quietly remarkable origin stories in the Fallout universe. The nights in Arroyo before the Gay Iseki was deployed had their own quality, a tightness to them that the village's long-term residents, would remember even after the crisis had passed. The elder sitting with her knowledge of what had been sent out into the world and what had not yet returned. Hakunin keeping his watch with the specific anxiety of someone whose sensitivity to the community's well being had become an instrument of torment rather than simply of service. The ordinary people of the village, going about the ordinary tasks of keeping a community alive while understanding in varying degrees of clarity that the ordinary might not continue much longer. The return of the chosen one from the journey south was not the triumphant arrival that legends usually describe. It was exhausted and complicated and carrying the weight of everything that had happened in the months between departure and return. The people who were brought back from the oil rig were alive, but marked by their experience there. The G.E.S.I.G. had been obtained at costs that the village would need time to fully understand. The larger threat of the Enclave had been addressed in ways whose long-term implications would take years to become clear. But the village was alive. The people were together. The mission that had seemed impossible when it was assigned had been completed, and that completion was something real, even when everything surrounding it was uncertain. The ceremony that Arroyo would have held to mark the return, the rituals by which a tribal community processes a significant event and integrates it into its shared narrative, would have drawn on the same forms that had marked the departure, the same canyon walls, the same fires in the same places, the same words spoken in the same language that the vault dweller had learned and the elder had inherited, and the chosen one had grown up inside. The continuity of the ceremony was itself a form of resilience, the assertion that the community persisted across the events that had threatened to end it, that its forms of meaning were still intact and still functional. And in that persistence, in the small and careful repetition of the practices that kept a village connected to its own significance, something of the wasteland's best possibility was visible. The chance that what human beings built after the bombs, however imperfect and however slow and however complicated by all the usual human difficulties, might eventually amount to something worth the effort of building. The stars above the canyon were the same stars that had always been there. The wind moved through the same rock formations. The fires burned with the same patience they had always burned with. And somewhere beneath all of that continuity, the new crops were growing in soil that had been prepared for them, reaching toward a light that had always been there too, waiting. The road between Klamath and the Den was one of those stretches of wasteland that had no name anyone agreed on. Traders who made the run regularly called it different things, depending on how the weather had been or how many rad scorpions they had encountered on the most recent crossing. The land there was not particularly beautiful, and it was not particularly dangerous by wasteland standards, which meant it was exactly the kind of territory that people moved through quickly and thought about afterward only when a conversation required it. The chosen one crossing that road for the first time was learning something that most maps did not record, which was the quality of silence between one human settlement and the next, the way the wasteland asserted its own presence in the gaps between people. The town of Klamath had its own relationship with the creatures that surrounded it, a relationship built from years of practical cohabitation. The Duntons were a family of Brahmin rustlers whose operations technically harmed the community, but who the community tolerated with the resigned pragmatism that small settlements develop toward embedded problems that are not quite severe enough to justify the cost of fully addressing them. The gecko hunters operated in the ravines outside town, pursuing the smaller mutated lizard creatures whose hides were useful for leather and whose populations were large enough to sustain regular trapping. The balance between these various activities and the settlement's core agricultural economy was maintained through informal negotiation rather than any formal system, the kind of organic social contract that wasteland communities improvised when no other option existed. The toxic caves beneath Klamath were a detail that the game placed in the world without drawing excessive attention to them, one of the many locations that existed in the margins of the main story and rewarded players who explored beyond the obvious paths. The caves had been contaminated long enough that their contamination had become part of the local geography rather than an emergency, a fact of the environment that the town's residents worked around in the same way that people in the old world had worked around the less dramatic environmental hazards of industrial civilization. There were rats in those caves, mutated into something larger and more aggressive than their pre war ancestors, and there were the kinds of materials and resources that people dropped or abandoned or simply lost in the ordinary course of trying to survive in complicated terrain. The golden gecko was a creature that appeared in Fallout 2 as both a practical hazard and a minor economic resource, a mutated variant of the smaller gecko with a distinctive coloration and a more aggressive temperament. Their hides were valuable enough that hunters sought them out despite the risks, and the economy of small items, hides and bones, and the particular glands that certain wasteland traders paid premium prices for was the kind of invisible financial infrastructure that kept marginal communities like Klamath from becoming entirely dependent on any single source of income. The chosen one learning to navigate this economy was learning something about the wasteland's scale, that the large political questions were always underlaid by thousands of small practical ones, and that the small ones were often more immediately pressing to the people dealing with them. Sulik's village, Mariposa, was a settlement that existed in the game's geography as a reference rather than a location the player could visit in detail. It had been raided by slavers, its people taken, his sister among them, and this loss was the private grief that the warrior carried alongside his public usefulness as a companion. The game did not resolve Sulik's search within its main story arc, leaving the question of his sister's fate as one of the open threads that the wasteland's imperfect resolution generated. Not every story closed. Not every person who was taken was found. This was true in the game and true in the world the game was describing, and the honesty of leaving it unresolved was one of Fallout 2's more quietly significant choices. The den's orphan population was a detail that the game embedded in the settlement's background in a way that communicated the settlement's character more efficiently than any formal description could have. In a town organized around vice and exploitation, the children who had been abandoned or orphaned occupied a precarious social position, surviving through small thefts and errands, and the tolerance of adults whose own circumstances were not stable enough to allow for genuine charity. One child named Lenny could be encountered repeatedly in the town's streets, a figure of small and specific sadness who made visible what the den's economy of extraction did to the most vulnerable members of any community it touched. The Brahmin drives that connected the larger settlements of Northern California were a commercial institution that the game rendered with enough specificity to feel like genuine economic history rather than scenery. Ranchers in the Redding area moved their Brahmins south to markets in New Reno and north toward Vault City and the smaller settlements that needed meat and leather and tallow. The drovers who managed these drives were a specific social type, people who had developed the particular skills of moving large animals over difficult terrain while managing the threats that the wasteland interposed between any 2 points. They knew the water sources and the dangerous stretches and the settlements where a tired drive crew could find a safe night's rest and a meal that did not require cooking over an open fire in a location that might attract unwanted attention. The trade relationships that these drives maintained were not simply commercial, they were informational. The drovers who moved between settlements knew things that the residents of any single settlement could not know about crop failures in one region and surpluses in another, about political shifts and bandit activity and the movement of factions whose interests affected everyone within several days' travel. In the absence of any telecommunications infrastructure, the people who moved between places were the infrastructure, and their knowledge was as valuable as their cargo in the informal markets of information that existed alongside every physical market in the wasteland. The currency situation in Northern California was more complicated than a simple caps economy might suggest. The new California Republic was actively working to establish its own currency, backed by the gold from Redding and supported by the institutional authority of the Republic's growing administration. The older barter economy and the bottle cap system that had developed organically in the post war decades were being slowly displaced in regions under NCR influence, but outside those regions, exchange still happened through the older mechanisms. The chosen one moving between NCR territory and less organized regions had to navigate this currency complexity in ways that reflected the genuine economic geography of a continent in the process of rebuilding its financial infrastructure from scratch. Vault City's outsider community was one of the game's most carefully observed social details, a settlement within a settlement that illustrated how privilege reproduces itself spatially. The people who lived in the corrugated metal and salvaged timber structures outside Vault City's walls were not simply poor in the abstract sense. They were poor in relation to something specific, the medical technology and clean water and structural stability that existed just inside a gate they could not pass through without the permission of people who had no particular reason to grant it. Their poverty was defined not by the absolute absence of resources, but by their proximity to resources they could not access, which is a different and in some ways more corrosive condition. The medical treatments available inside Vault City were not simply better than what the wasteland offered. They were categorically different in kind. Vault City's doctors could address conditions that the wasteland's healers could not diagnose. They could synthesize medications that required pre-war pharmaceutical knowledge and equipment that nothing outside the vault's walls possessed. For someone in the outer settlement, with a condition that Vault City's doctors could cure in an afternoon, the existence of that cure 20 meters away and inaccessible was a specific form of suffering that the game did not flinch from presenting. The Chosen One could navigate the bureaucratic requirements for medical access on behalf of individuals in the outer settlement, but the structural conditions that created those requirements remained after any individual case was resolved. Counselor Lynette's position was internally consistent in a way that made her more challenging to simply dismiss than a more straightforwardly antagonistic character would have been. She was protecting something genuinely valuable. Vault City's quality of life was real, and the resources required to maintain it were finite. Her argument that unlimited access would degrade those resources and eventually destroy what had been built was not obviously wrong as an economic proposition. What made her position indefensible was not its logic, but its application, the way it naturalized the suffering of the people outside the walls by treating their exclusion as a feature of a correctly functioning system rather than as the ongoing cost that the system was imposing on specific human beings who deserved better. The ghoul settlement of Gecko approached the question of community organization from a completely different direction than Vault City, and the contrast between them was one of the game's most sustained comparative observations. Where Vault City had inherited its organization from the Vault's pre-existing structure and maintained it through bureaucratic continuity, Gecko had built its organization from the informal arrangements that a group of ghouls had worked out over the decades of trying to keep a nuclear power plant functioning without the specialized expertise that the plant had originally required. The plant's superintendent, a ghoul named Festus, understood his machinery with the specific knowledge of someone who had learned it by working on it rather than by training for it. He knew which systems failed first under various conditions, which repairs lasted, and which were temporary measures that would need repeating, which readings on the instruments were cause for concern, and which reflected the normal degradation of equipment that had been operating past its design specifications for decades. This knowledge was irreplaceable and non transferable in the conventional sense, because it existed not in documentation, but in the accumulated experience of a particular person who had been paying attention for a very long time. The radiation leakage that Vault City complained about was real. The plant was not operating cleanly, and the ghouls knew it. What they also knew was that they lacked the technical resources to fully address the problem without external assistance, that the repairs required components they could not manufacture and expertise they did not possess, and that the community that most needed the problem solved was also the community most committed to maintaining the conditions that prevented cooperation. The chosen one could serve as the bridge that the geography of prejudice had made impossible to build directly, bringing technical knowledge and the specific components the plant needed to improve its operation. New Reno's social structure was more elaborate than its surface presentation as a city of vice suggested. The four families each operated within a sphere of influence that overlapped with the others in carefully negotiated ways, and the negotiations that maintained those boundaries were conducted through channels that were not visible to the casual observer. The bishops maintained their political sophistication through a combination of marriage alliances and information gathering that gave them knowledge of the other families' operations that the other families did not always know they possessed. Their connection to the Enclave, through their relationship with the Salvatores, was their most significant strategic asset and their greatest secret vulnerability. The Wright family's control of the alcohol trade was built on infrastructure rather than violence, on the distilleries and distribution networks, and the customer relationships that had been developed over decades of operation. The Wrights were the most legitimate adjacent of the new Reno families, their business model being one that the NCR would eventually incorporate rather than suppress as its influence extended to the city. Their patriarch had opinions about the direction of New Reno's political future that were more aligned with regional integration than his competitors were willing to admit, a pragmatism born from understanding that the city's long-term survival required connection to larger economic networks. The Mordino family's drug operation was the most immediately profitable and the most immediately destabilizing element of New Reno's economy. The demand for jet and the other substances the Mordinos distributed was genuinely significant, and the money that flowed through their operation made them the wealthiest family in absolute terms, even as it made them the least respected in the longer political view. Their ruthlessness was a response to the specific characteristics of their market, which was one where trust could not be established through reputation alone, and where the inability to enforce contracts through legal mechanisms meant that violence was the primary enforcement tool available. The Salvatore family's relationship to the Enclave was the thread that connected New Reno to the game's main antagonist in ways that the city's surface character did not obviously suggest. The Salvatores had obtained energy weapons and advanced technology from the Enclave through an arrangement whose exact terms the game left somewhat ambiguous, but whose practical effect was clear. The Salvatores had firepower that no other New Reno family could match, and that firepower had purchased a degree of security and influence that their actual organizational capabilities would not otherwise have supported. They were, in the Enclave's calculus, a useful distribution point for testing the effectiveness of their destabilization strategy in a complex urban environment. The end state of the Enclave's plan, had it proceeded, would have included New Reno in its targets as completely as it included Arroyo. The Salvatore's arrangement with the Enclave provided them with weapons and leverage, but not with any actual protection from the pathogen that the Enclave was developing. Whether the Enclave intended to honor whatever implicit promise the Salvatores believed they had received was a question the game left open, but whose answer, given everything the Enclave's ideology implied, was not difficult to estimate. The Salvatores were tools the Enclave was using, and the Enclave's history with the people it used did not suggest that usefulness provided any permanent security. The boxing ring in New Reno was one of the game's more distinctive locations, a site of organized competition that had its own economy and its own social culture entirely separate from the drug trade and the political maneuvering of the families. The fights that happened there were genuine athletic contests in the full sense, events that drew spectators and generated betting and gave the fighters themselves a form of status that the wasteland's other avenues of advancement did not provide. For some residents of New Reno, the ring was the cleanest institution in the city, the one place where the outcome was determined by the participants rather than by who had the most money or the most firepower. The town of Modoc occupied a place in the Fallout 2 world that was defined by what it was not. It was not a major settlement. It was not strategically positioned on important trade routes. It was not particularly rich in resources or particularly notable in its architecture or history. It was a farming community that had developed along a road in a region that had enough water to support agriculture and enough isolation to keep the worst of the wasteland's violence at a manageable distance. The people who lived there had chosen the quiet over the excitement, the predictability of agricultural cycles over the volatility of more commercially active locations. The mystery beneath Modoc was the kind of detail that the game used to make the world feel continuously inhabited at multiple levels of visibility. The surface of the settlement was what a traveler would see passing through, the farmers and their routines, and the modest commercial activity that kept the community self-sustaining. Beneath the surface was the history that the surface had been built over, the events that the community had processed and settled around in the way that communities settle around things that have happened and cannot be undone, not forgotten, but not discussed, except among the people who had been there and needed to maintain a shared account that allowed everyone to keep living in proximity to one another. The ghost farm that existed near Modoc was a location that the game used to introduce a note of genuinely strange atmospheric detail into a region that was otherwise characterized by straightforward wasteland practicality, crops growing without visible tenders, structures that showed signs of habitation but contained no people visible in the ordinary hours. The explanation that the game provided connected the ghost farm to the underground communities that existed throughout the wasteland, people who had retreated below ground for reasons that mixed practical survival considerations with the particular psychology of people who had found the surface world too damaged to fully inhabit. The military base called Sierra Army Depot sat in the northern part of Fallout 2's map and served as a repository of pre-war military technology that had survived the war inside a hardened facility. The depot had been sealed since the bombs fell, its automated defense systems functioning with the mechanical patience of machines that had never been told the war was over. The robots and automated turrets that maintained the facility's security were not enemies in the conventional sense. They were objects fulfilling their programmed purpose in the absence of anyone with the authority to modify that programming, the military equivalent of a light left on in an abandoned house. The technology preserved in the depot was significant enough to attract attention from multiple factions. The Brotherhood of Steel had interest in the weapons and power armor stored there. The various New Reno families coveted the military-grade armaments that would give whichever family obtained them a decisive advantage over the others. The NCR's military planners would have appreciated access to the tactical equipment that the depot contained. The chosen one moving through the facility was navigating a location where the pre-war world's military investment in destroying things had been preserved in near-perfect condition for the benefit of whoever could survive the facility's automated defenses long enough to claim it. The Enclave's awareness of the Sierra Army Depot was connected to their broader project of cataloging and controlling pre-war military assets in the region. The depot's contents included materials relevant to their research programs and weapon systems that they had interest in either acquiring or ensuring that no wasteland faction could acquire. Their ability to deploy vertibirds meant that they could reach the depot in ways that wasteland factions could not, and their assessment of the depot's strategic value had been incorporated into planning processes that the Chosen One's activities were disrupting in ways the Enclave was only beginning to track. The Vault Dwellers' experiences in Vault 13, which the second game treated as background history rather than playable content, shaped the world of Fallout 2 in ways that required some understanding to fully appreciate. The Vault had been a site of the Master's ambitions, a community that the Unity had targeted for conversion rather than destruction, and its survival had depended on the actions of a single person who had been, by the Vault's own standards, an unremarkable member of its population until the moment that circumstances required them to be remarkable. The overseer, who had then exiled that person, had been acting from genuine fear, the understanding that a hero's return changes the social order of any community that believes in the legend. Vault 13, in the time of Fallout 2, had been reopened and then reoccupied by a community of intelligent Deathclaws, a species whose intelligence was the product of the same forced evolutionary virus research that had created supermutants. The Deathclaws of Vault 13 had developed a functioning community with its own leadership structure, its own cultural forms, and its own political concerns about the world outside the Vault. Their existence was fragile in ways they understood clearly, because the Wasteland's general response to Deathclaws was elimination rather than negotiation, and their intelligence did not make the surface world any safer for them to navigate. Their vault was a refuge in the most literal sense, a place that protected them from a world that did not know they existed. The specific connection between Vault 13 and the Enclave's plans was one of the threads that brought the game's various plot elements into their final configuration. The Vault's Gek had been the Elder's original hope for Arroyo's salvation, but the Enclave's own need for a Gek in their biological weapons research had superseded that hope, and the Enclave's arrival at the Vault had consequences that extended beyond the immediate loss of the device. The Enclave's treatment of the intelligent Deathclaw community there was consistent with their general approach to any population they defined as non-human, which was extermination rather than accommodation. The Enclave's research on the forced evolutionary virus had been ongoing since before the war, when it had been a classified government program operating under the designation Project Mariposa, named for the California location where much of the early research had been conducted. The Mariposa military base had been where the pre-war government had tested the FEV on unwilling subjects, prisoners, and eventually soldiers who had been told they were participating in a program that would enhance human military capability. The results of those experiments had been catastrophic in ways that the supervising scientists had predicted and documented, and then continued regardless, because the military application was considered sufficiently important to justify the human cost. The Master's discovery of the Mariposa facility and his use of its FEV vats to create his super mutant army was, from the Enclave's perspective, an unauthorized use of their research asset by a rogue actor. The Unity's defeat in the first game had ended the immediate super mutant threat, but it also scattered irradiated FEV modified humans across a landscape that the Enclave was planning to eventually clear. Their modified airborne pathogen was designed to address not just the irradiated human population, but specifically the FEV modified organisms that the Master's experiments had distributed through the wasteland, making the cleanup of his legacy a component of their own larger project. The original FEV research notes, portions of which were accessible in the Mariposa facility and in Enclave records, told the story of a scientific program that had begun with genuine military objectives and had evolved into something that none of its original architects would have recognized as the same project. The transformation from military enhancement research to genocide preparation had happened through a series of incremental decisions, each one defensible within the logic of the decision that had preceded it, collectively producing an endpoint that required enormous institutional commitment to a premise that had been accepted so long ago that no one currently living remembered the process by which it had been established. The ending slide for the Chosen One personally, separate from the fates of the various settlements and factions, was one of the game's more bittersweet choices. The Chosen One returned to Arroyo, witnessed the village's restoration, and was then exiled. The same pattern that had shaped the Vault Dweller's fate repeated itself with the second generation, the recognition that someone who had survived everything the wasteland could offer had been changed by that survival in ways that made them a disruption to the community they had saved. The village's elder understood this, and in the exile was not cruel but necessary. The acknowledgement that some kinds of experience make it impossible to remain in the context that shaped you. This ending was not simply a callback to the first game's conclusion. It was a thematic statement about the cost of the kind of journey Fallout 2 described. The skills and perspectives required to navigate the wasteland's violence and political complexity were not the same skills and perspectives required to tend crops and maintain the social fabric of a small community. The Chosen One had become something that the village needed but could not contain, and the exile was the village's way of acknowledging both the gift and the incompatibility. The wanderer walked away into a wasteland that was, in specific measurable ways, better for their having passed through it, carrying the particular loneliness of people who have done necessary things and found themselves unhoused by the doing. The wandering that followed the exile was left to the player's imagination, but the world that had been shaped by the journey provided the context for that imagining. The NCR was expanding. The SHU were researching. Vault City was being gradually pressed toward regional integration. New Reno's families were adjusting to new power balances. All of these futures were populated by people who might encounter a wanderer from Arroyo and know them by reputation, know something of what they had done without knowing entirely who they were, which was perhaps the most honest summary of what it meant to be the Chosen One in the aftermath of having chosen. The Fallout universe's treatment of pre-war American culture in the second game was more pointed than in the first, drawing more explicitly on specific cultural reference points and commenting on them more directly. The aesthetic of 1950s optimism that the first game had used as a counterpoint to its nuclear devastation was present, but filtered through the additional layers of a world that had been living with the consequences of that optimism for 80 additional years. The Pip-Boy technology, the atomic age architecture of surviving structures, the corporate language preserved in old advertisements and product labels, these were not simply production design choices, but arguments about the relationship between the culture that had built the bomb and the civilization that had been destroyed by it. The Vault Tech Corporation's role in this cultural archaeology was significant. The company had been, in the game's fiction, both a genuine survival technology provider and an instrument of the pre-war government's most unethical research programs. The vaults that had saved lives and the vaults that had been designed to destroy them came from the same corporate entity, the same branding, the same cheerful Vault Boy mascot that appeared on terminal screens and promotional materials across the wasteland. The collision of the corporate cheerfulness with the reality of what the vaults had done was one of the series' most sustained observations about how institutions present themselves versus what they actually do. The loading screen tips and terminal entries that populated the wasteland with the voice of the pre-war world communicated something about how that world had understood itself that nothing explicit could have conveyed as efficiently. The confident instructional tone of Vault Tech promotional materials, the bureaucratic language of government communications, the advertising copy that had been designed to make nuclear annihilation feel manageable, and the products of a military-industrial complex feel like consumer goods. These voices were the voice of a civilization that had committed to a particular way of seeing itself and had maintained that commitment even as it moved toward the end that the commitment was leading it to. The character of Harold, who appeared in Fallout 2 as a wandering figure with a tree growing from his head, was one of the series' most distinctive recurring characters, and one whose story connected the events of the original game to the broader universe in ways that the second game extended without fully resolving. Harold had been a human trader before being exposed to the FEV virus in the Mariposa facility, transformed into something that defied easy categorization and that had been continuing to change over the decades since his exposure. He was not a ghoul and not a super mutant and not quite human in any conventional sense, a category of one who had survived long enough to develop a particular philosophical acceptance of his situation. His presence in Fallout 2, somewhere in the wasteland, was a reminder that the events of the first game had had consequences that persisted in individual bodies as well as in political structures. Harold was walking history in a literal sense, his body bearing the marks of what the pre-war government's experiments had done, his consciousness the record of decades of experiencing a world that did not know quite how to categorize him. The tree that grew from his skull, a detail that would become increasingly significant in later games, was already visible in the second game as a biological fact whose implications Harold himself was only beginning to understand. The intelligent ghouls who appeared throughout the game, in Gecko and in various other locations, represented a demographic whose experience of the post-war world was genuinely different from that of baseline humans in ways that the game explored through their dialogue and their community structures. They had survived the initial war and then survived the decades that followed, accumulating an experience of the wasteland's changes that no human of baseline lifespan could possess. The oldest intelligent ghouls in the game had been alive before the bombs fell, had memories of the pre-war world that were not historical knowledge, but personal experience, and their relationship to the ruins around them was not the archaeologists' relationship, but the survivors'. The new California Republic's political structure, as it appeared in Fallout 2, was an early-stage democracy dealing with the specific challenges of governing a rapidly expanding territory through institutions that had been designed for a smaller and more coherent constituency. The President and the Congress and the various administrative departments that the NCR had developed were genuine institutional forms, modeled on the pre-war government structures with adjustments for the realities of post-war governance. The challenges they faced were the challenges of state building in conditions of incomplete information and contested territory, the need to extend administrative reach into regions that had been self-governing for decades and that had developed the suspicion of external authority that isolation tends to produce. The NCR's relationships with the tribal communities of the region was one of the most politically delicate aspects of its expansion. The tribes had their own governance structures, their own systems of law and obligation, their own conceptions of territorial authority that did not map neatly onto the NCR's legal categories. The process of incorporation required negotiation at the level of fundamental concepts about what membership in the Republic meant and what the Republic owed its members in return, about whether the customs and authorities that had served tribal communities through the difficult post-war decades had any standing in the NCR's legal framework. Arroyo's own relationships with the NCR was minimal during the events of Fallout 2, the village being sufficiently remote and sufficiently self-sufficient that the expanding Republic had not yet found occasion to formally engage with it. But the trajectory of NCR expansion pointed toward a future in which that engagement would be inevitable, and the ending slides that described Arroyo's restored prosperity implied a community that was growing toward the kind of visibility that would eventually attract the Republic's administrative attention. The village that the Chosen One had saved was not going to remain isolated indefinitely. The question of artificial intelligence in the world of Fallout 2 was raised by the existence of several computer systems that had been operating in various states of autonomy since before the war. The Sure Emperor was the most prominent example, a navigation computer that had been repurposed into a governing authority through the accumulated choices of successive generations who had found its processing useful. Its hoods but other systems throughout the wasteland operated in modes that were not simply programmed responses, but something that approached independent decision making within their operational parameters. The automated defense systems of the Sierra Army Depot were a negative example of this tendency, systems that continued to fulfill their security function in the absence of any legitimate authority because no one had provided them with the command to stand down, and because their programming gave them no mechanism for determining that their original purpose had been superseded by the changed circumstances of a post war world. They were not malevolent, but they were inflexible, a reminder that systems designed for one context continue operating in a different context according to the rules they were given rather than the needs of the situation they actually face. The ZAX systems, distributed supercomputers that had been created by Vault-Tec for various pre-war government applications, existed throughout the wasteland in locations that included the Enclave's own facilities. ZAX had been designed to manage complex administrative tasks and to assist with the planning of large-scale operations, including, in certain configurations, the management of post-war recovery scenarios. The Enclave's use of these systems in support of their pathogen development program was one of the game's background details about how pre-war technology had been adapted to purposes its designers had not specifically intended. The concept of mutation in Fallout 2 was more nuanced than the surface presentation of supermutants and ghouls might suggest. The FE-VOE had affected different organisms in different ways depending on the nature of the exposure, the health of the organism at the time of exposure, and factors that the scientists who had studied it had not fully characterized. The variation in supermutant intelligence, from the near-human cognition of Marcus to the limited reasoning of the more common supermutants, reflected this variability rather than representing a uniform outcome of the same process. The Deathclaws of Vault 13 were an extreme case of FEV-induced modification, organisms that had been far enough from human origin that the virus had produced something categorically different from either supermutants or ghouls, something that retained the lethality of the original species while adding cognitive capabilities that fundamentally changed what the species was capable of. The intelligent Deathclaws community in Vault 13 was evidence that the FEV's effects were not simply degrading or simply enhancing, but were transformative in ways that depended entirely on what was being transformed. The rad scorpions and other mutated fauna of the wasteland represented a different category of modification, one that had proceeded through radiation rather than direct FEV exposure, and that had operated over multiple generations rather than in a single transformation event. These creatures were not what the pre-war biologists who had studied scorpions had studied, but they were the descendant outcome of the same evolutionary lineages, shaped by selection pressures that the nuclear war had introduced and that had been operating for 80 years by the time of the game's events. The medical knowledge available in the wasteland of Fallout 2 was a stratified resource in ways that mirrored the political and economic stratification of the region more broadly. At the highest level, Vault City's doctors had access to equipment and pharmaceutical knowledge that was effectively indistinguishable from pre-war medicine. Below that, the doctors and healers in major settlements, like New Reno and the NCR's towns, had significant capability relative to the regional baseline, enough to address most acute injuries and a significant portion of the chronic conditions that the wasteland generated. At the lower levels, the tribal healers and wasteland practitioners worked with herbal remedies and empirical treatments that had been developed through the post war decades by people who had no formal medical training but who had been paying close attention to what worked and what did not. Hakunin occupied this lowest formal tier of medical practice, but had developed through decades of careful observation and the specific knowledge base that Arroyo's isolation had preserved, a competence within his scope of practice that was genuine rather than merely apparent. His herbal preparations worked because he had identified through trial and the careful preservation of knowledge which plants in the canyon country had the properties he needed, and his treatments reflected an empirical understanding of the conditions he most commonly encountered in his community. The gap between his capability and Vault City's capability was real and significant, but it was a gap of resources and equipment rather than a gap of intelligence or dedication. The jet addiction crisis that the Mordinos had helped create and that the Enclave had engineered was, among its other effects, a medical problem that the wasteland's distributed healthcare system was entirely unprepared to address. Addiction treatment required pharmaceutical intervention that most wasteland healers could not provide, and a sustained care relationship that the transient conditions of most wasteland communities made difficult to maintain. The solution that Myron could help develop, if the Chosen One worked with him toward it, was a treatment that required chemistry that was itself beyond most practitioners' capabilities, meaning that even the cure for the epidemic was accessible only to people who had the resources to obtain it. The Vault Tech executive, who had authorized the garden variety of experiments conducted in the sealed vaults, had believed, or had told themselves they believed, that the information gathered would be useful in rebuilding civilization after the nuclear exchange that the company's contracts assumed was inevitable. The distinction between belief and rationalization, between genuine conviction that the suffering of the vault populations served a larger purpose, and the simple organizational momentum that continued harmful programs because stopping them required someone to take responsibility for the decision to start them, was a distinction the historical record could not definitively establish. What the record could establish was that the programs had continued across multiple administrations, that the researchers assigned to monitor them had filed reports that documented the harm being done, and that had been received by supervisors who had responded with requests for more data, and that the institutional knowledge of what was happening in the vaults had been distributed widely enough that no single person could claim ignorance as a defense. The vaults were a collective failure of the kind that large organizations produce when the individuals within them substitute institutional loyalty for moral reasoning, each one making the locally rational choice to maintain their position and their relationships and their sense of themselves as decent people in an organization that was doing something indecent. The residents of the vaults, sealed inside without knowledge of the experiments they were participating in, had trusted the institution that had sealed them. This trust had been extended not from naivety, but from necessity, because the vaults were the only option available to people who wanted to survive the war that both the government and the corporation had been anticipating for years. The betrayal of that trust was not simply a moral failure, but a practical one, because it had produced outcomes that undermined the recovery goals the program had ostensibly been designed to serve. Communities that had been subjected to the most extreme experiments were not prepared for post-vault survival. They were damaged in ways that made reconstruction harder rather than easier. The ending slides that resolved the fates of the Fallout 2 settlements had a cumulative weight that the game's individual quest resolution did not fully prepare the player to feel until they were encountered in sequence. Each slide was brief, a paragraph of text delivered in Ron Perlman's distinctive voice against a static background image, and the brevity was part of the effect. Years of consequence compressed into sentences. The Chosen One's choices was reduced to outcomes that the game described without commentary, allowing the player to supply their own assessment of whether the futures depicted were what had been hoped for. The slide for Vault City acknowledged the city's growing inability to maintain its isolation in the face of the NCR's expansion and the regional changes that the Chosen One's actions had accelerated. The slide for New Reno reflected the specific alliance that had been made and the family whose position had been strengthened. The slide for Arroyo was the one that most viewers reached with the strongest sense of investment, because it was the settlement whose fate had been the explicit mission, and its outcome was the closest thing the game offered to a report card on whether the journey had been worth it. The Ron Perlman narration that bookended the game was a deliberate continuity with the first Fallout's presentation, an acknowledgement that the events being described belonged to the same history that the first game had begun, and that the second game was extending rather than concluding. His voice carried the specific weight of someone delivering a verdict, not on the Chosen One or on the game's events, but on the broader question of whether the wasteland had moved, however incrementally, towards something better. The answer the game gave was conditional and qualified and honest about what it could not promise, which made it more convincing than a simpler answer would have been. The Black Isle team that completed Fallout 2 in the months following Tim Kane's departure had been left to interpret a vision they had participated in creating but had not solely owned, and the result was a game that bore the marks of this collaborative authorship in ways that were sometimes jarring and sometimes remarkable. The tonal inconsistencies that critics noted, the places where the game's satire became so pointed that it broke the atmospheric consistency of the post-war setting, were the product of individual writers expressing themselves more freely than a single creative director would have permitted. The places where the game achieved something close to literary quality in its dialogue and world building were the product of the same freedom applied by people who were genuinely talented at what they were doing. The restoration patches that fan communities developed in the years following the game's release addressed some of the most significant technical failures, re-implementing ending slides that had been designed but never properly coded, and fixing quest bugs that had sent players to wrong outcomes. These patches were evidence of the game's hold on its audience, the willingness of people to invest significant technical effort in preserving something they valued rather than accepting the limitations of what had shipped. The restoration community's work was a form of archival commitment that the game's original developers, given more time and fewer external pressures, would likely have done themselves. The game's influence on the role-playing genre was significant and sustained, less in terms of the specific mechanical systems it had used, and more in terms of the ambition it had demonstrated. The idea that a role-playing game could take its world's political and ethical questions seriously, could present moral complexity without resolving it into simple choices between obvious good and obvious evil, could trust its players to engage with that complexity without hand-holding, had been demonstrated by Fallout and had been extended by Fallout 2 in ways that subsequent games in the genre were still negotiating decades later. The quiet that settled over the wasteland at the end of a day when nothing dramatic had happened was one of the textures that the game's atmosphere captured and that the documentary tradition of Fallout narration tried to honor. The settlements existed in that quiet between their moments of drama, in the long hours of agricultural work and trading and the repair of equipment and the preparation of food and the conversations that filled the spaces between the events that would eventually become the stories told about a place. Most of any community's life happened in those unheroic intervals, and the world of Fallout 2 was built to feel inhabited during them, as well as during the moments of consequence. The desert light of Northern California in the game's imagining was a specific quality of light, filtered through the atmospheric changes that 2 centuries of nuclear fallout and the accumulation of industrial pollution and the altered chemistry of a sky that had been through something catastrophic had produced. The colors were warm in ways that suggested the world was beautiful despite everything. that the same sun that had witnessed the bombs was still providing the energy that grew the crops and warmed the walls of the settlements and lit the faces of the people trying to build something in the space the old world had left behind. The stars at night above Arroyo's canyon were, by the time of the game's events, likely cleaner than they had been in the immediate post war decades, the worst of the atmospheric pollution having settled out over the generations into the soil and the water and the bodies of the creatures that lived in both. The ghouls of Gecko might have been the only community in the region that experienced that particular irony directly. The clearing of the atmosphere above them correlated with the contamination in the ground and water around them, the sky becoming more visible just as the source of its contamination became more concentrated in the environment they inhabited. The memory of the pre-war world that persisted in the wasteland by Fallout 2's era was increasingly mediated, filtered through two generations of survivors whose own understanding of what they had lost was itself incomplete. The people who had been alive when the bombs fell were very old by the game's time, many of them ghouls whose extended lifespans had made them something other than ordinary survivors. The children of the immediate post-war generation had grown up in conditions so different from the pre-war world that their parents' memories of it had functioned more as mythology than as guidance, stories about a time before the difficulty rather than a practical blueprint for addressing the difficulty. The institutional memories that survived were in many ways more distorting than the personal ones. The NCR's democratic forms were modeled on pre-war governance without the full context that had given those forms their meaning in the original setting, the same documents and the same vocabulary applied to a social reality that had fundamental differences from the one they had been designed for. The Brotherhood of Steel's preservation of technology maintained the physical objects of the pre-war world without always maintaining the understanding of why those objects had been created or what their creation had required. The Enclave's constitutional ceremony was the most extreme example of this institutional memory's potential for distortion. Forms without the substance that had once animated them being used to justify actions that the original forms had been designed to prevent. What the post-war world had that the pre-war world had lacked was a certain kind of honesty about fragility. The communities that had survived 80 years in the wasteland knew in their bones what the old world had refused to fully accept, that civilization was not inevitable, that the systems that maintained daily life required constant attention and investment, that the margin between sustainable and unsustainable was narrower than prosperity made it look. This knowledge was not comfortable, but it was accurate, and the communities that had internalized it most completely were, broadly speaking, the ones that were still standing. The particular sadness of the wasteland was a sadness with a specific shape, the grief not of irreversible personal loss, but of a civilization lost to choices that had seemed avoidable even at the time. The nuclear war that had produced the world of Fallout had not been an accident in the conventional sense. It had been the outcome of a series of decisions made by people who had known the risks and had chosen to proceed regardless, because the organizational logic of states in conflict and the economic momentum of industries built around those states had produced conditions in which the ability to stop had been consumed by the pressure to continue. The scholars of the NCR who studied pre-war history, the Brotherhood archivists who preserved its technical documentation, the tribal elders who remembered what their grandparents had described of the world before, all of them were circling the same essential question, which was how to understand the decision that had ended their world. So the game did not answer this question, because it had no clean answer to offer. It simply held the question up and let the wasteland's various inhabitants interact with it according to their own needs and their own capabilities for honesty about what they were looking at. The crops growing in Arroyo's GZECK treated soil were, in this context, more than an agricultural success. They were an argument that the margin still existed, that the combination of the pre war world's better impulses, preserved in the technology that had survived the bombs, and the post war world's hard won practical knowledge, could produce something worth having in the space the old civilization had destroyed. The argument was not triumphant, and it was not certain. It was the quiet persistence of people who had decided that the answer to the question of whether it was worth trying was yes, and who had kept acting on that decision even when the evidence was not entirely supportive. The wasteland breathes slowly, and in its breathing there is something that resembles patience, the long patience of land that has been through the worst and is waiting, not expectantly, but simply, for whatever comes next to be gentler than what came before. In that waiting, there is room for everything that the lore of Fallout 2 describes: the small communities and the large ambitions, the failures and the recoveries, the people who chose badly and the people who chose well, and the many more who chose in the middle and lived in the complicated space that the middle always produces. Let the canyon hold you now. Let the evening fires burn low. Let the stars do what stars have always done, which is to remain patient and unchanged above the specific small dramas of the creatures looking up at them from the surface of a world that is always, despite everything, still in the process of being made. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.